I was 31 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the remote parts of Montana. I'd been dealing with burnout from work. I had a small landscaping business outside of Missoula, and the stress of running it, plus a recent breakup, had left me feeling drained. I wanted to get away from people, phones, and noise. I needed a reset. So, I loaded up my old green Ford Ranger with my camping gear and drove out toward the Bitterroot National Forest. I had no real plan except to go where the roads got narrow and the trees got thick. I picked an area on the map that didn't have many trailheads or nearby campgrounds, just endless forest. It was early August, hot during the day, but the nights still dipped into the low 40s. I brought enough food for 4 days, a tent, a .38 revolver. I kept more for animals than people, and a cheap GPS unit. I also printed out a topo map from an old forestry website because I didn't trust the electronics alone. After about 4 hours of rough driving on logging roads that seemed like they hadn't been maintained since the 80s, I found a small clearing a couple hundred feet off a dry creek bed. It was flat, surrounded by tall lodgepole pines, and far enough from the road to feel isolated. I parked my truck, slung my pack on, and hiked another 20 minutes into the woods until I found an even better spot near a group of boulders. Felt safe, quiet, peaceful. The first night went by without much to mention. I set up camp, boiled water for dehydrated chili, and sat on a rock until the stars came out. It got cold quickly after sunset. I threw on a flannel and sat close to the little fire I built in a ring of rocks. No wind, no distant engines, no voices, just trees and the crackle of the fire. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next day, I decided to follow the dry creek bed and explore. I took my small day pack with a knife, some granola, a lighter, and my GPS. The creek twisted through dense trees, and I wandered for a couple hours, just enjoying the feeling of walking without a goal. Around mid-afternoon, I came across something that didn't quite sit right with me. It was a pile of bones, small ones, maybe from a deer or elk calf, but they weren't scattered like a predator kill. They were stacked, neatly, almost like someone had placed them in a pile, ribs laid across the spine, skull on top. No flesh left, but no sign of chewing either. I crouched down and poked at them with a stick. They weren't old, maybe a few weeks. Flies still hovered nearby. I shook it off. People do weird things out in the woods. Hunters, maybe, or some kid trying to be edgy. Still, it gave me a weird feeling in my chest. I headed back to camp before sunset. That night, I kept the fire a little bigger and closer to the tent. I loaded the revolver and kept it inside my sleeping bag. I wasn't scared, exactly, but something about that bone pile kept turning in my head. I kept thinking of how careful the stack was, like it wasn't just for disposal, like it meant something to whoever or whatever made it. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up. No sound, no dreams, just wide awake, like a switch flipped in my brain. I lay still for a minute listening. The fire had burned out. No wind, no rustling trees, but I felt something was off, a kind of pressure in the air, not like weather, like being watched. I sat up and unzipped the tent slowly. The moon was high, bright enough to see the outline of trees around me. I scanned the woods. Nothing moved. Then I saw it, something faint, a spot of white about 30 yards away, near one of the larger boulders. I squinted. It wasn't glowing or anything stupid like that, just pale. I thought maybe it was a plastic bag or a faded patch of bark. I leaned out a little more. The shape moved. Not fast, not directly toward me. Just a small shift, like a person adjusting their weight. I froze. My heart started hammering. I watched for what felt like 10 minutes. The shape didn't move again. I slid back inside the tent and zipped it shut. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed up camp. I didn't care if it was a bear, a person, or just my imagination. Something out there made me feel wrong. I wanted to get back to the truck and head home. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore, but getting back wasn't simple. I hadn't marked the trail back well, thinking I could follow the creek again. But in the daylight, everything looked different. I walked in the direction I thought was right, but after an hour, I still hadn't found the road. My GPS refused to power on. Dead batteries or just broken? I kicked myself for not bringing spares. I used the map and tried to keep moving west, thinking I'd eventually hit the road. Around mid-morning, I stopped to eat and noticed something strange again. Boot prints. Fresh ones. Not mine. They were deep, made by heavy hiking boots, and they moved perpendicular to my direction. I followed them for a few minutes, hoping they'd lead to a trail or another camper. But they just stopped in a small clearing, next to a ring of flat stones like a campfire spot, except there was no ash, no soot, just clean stones. I turned around and headed the other way, heart racing again. By late afternoon, I found the dry creek bed again, but it didn't look like the same section I had followed before. I followed it anyway, hoping it would lead somewhere. As the sun started to drop, I came across a torn tarp, faded blue, tangled in tree branches about 6 feet off the ground. Beneath it, broken plastic containers and a shredded sleeping bag. All faded like they'd been there a while. No ID, no trash that could tell me who left it. I didn't like the idea of camping near it, but night was coming fast. I set up my tent in a new spot near a rock outcrop and skipped the fire. I wanted to stay hidden. I didn't eat much, just laid down with my revolver and kept the tent zipped tight. I was too tired to stay awake, but too scared to really sleep. That night, I heard footsteps, slow, crunching leaves, one at a time with long pauses in between. I held my breath. They circled the tent once, maybe twice. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. The steps stopped just behind me where my head was. Then silence. I lay there, paralyzed, for over an hour. When morning came, I opened the tent. Nothing, just the same trees and rocks. But in the dirt behind my tent, there were prints. Human ones, barefoot. I didn't think. I ran. I grabbed what I could carry and started moving as fast as I could west. I didn't care if I had to hike for miles. I needed to get out. Every time I stopped to breathe, I imagined someone just out of view, behind a tree or crouched low in the brush. Around noon, I heard an engine, faint but real. I scrambled up a ridge and saw it. A dusty road and a red SUV moving slow. I shouted and waved my arms. They didn't see me, but I marked the direction and sprinted through the trees, tripping and falling twice before I burst out onto the road. I followed the road south until I hit a paved one, then flagged down a trucker who drove me all the way back to Missoula. I didn't tell him much, just that I got turned around hiking. Back home, I showered 4 times and threw away the boots I wore. I didn't sleep for days. I told a friend about it, just a basic version. Got lost, saw weird stuff, spooked myself. He laughed and said that's what I get for going alone. A week later, I reported the tarp and campsite I'd found to the ranger station. They sent a team to check. When they called me back, they said they found it, but it was old, probably abandoned 3 or 4 years ago. No sign of recent activity. I asked about the boot prints. They didn't find any, or the bones. I don't know what I saw out there. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe not. But I haven't been camping since. Not alone. Not even close. I sold the revolver, sold the truck, and started doing weekend trips to the coast instead, places with people, with lights. I miss the quiet sometimes, but I'd rather hear city noise than wonder who, or what, is standing outside my tent at night, listening. I was 32 that summer, living alone in a small rental apartment in Kansas City. Life had gotten too loud and crowded, and I needed a break from everything: work, noise, screens, people. I wanted quiet, real quiet. I'd spend a few years hiking now and then on weekends, sometimes camping overnight in state parks, but I had never gone deep into the woods alone. That year, in 2021, I finally did. It was late August. I picked a spot in southern Missouri, near the Ozark National Scenic Riverways. A stretch of public land along the current river had no official campsites, just open forest and a few rough dirt trails branching off from the gravel service roads. I'd read a couple of posts from other hikers about it. They said it was isolated, peaceful, and rarely patrolled. That was what I wanted. No neighbors, no noise, just me and the forest for a few days. I packed light but carefully. A one-man tent, sleeping bag, water filter, basic food like jerky and granola, 2 canisters of stove fuel, a pot, a knife, a first aid kit, a bear canister, Even though black bears there were rare, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a trail map. I left my phone in airplane mode and tossed it in the bottom of my bag. I wanted to disconnect completely. I drove down early on a Thursday morning. It was hot, mid-90s, humid, but I didn't mind. I parked at a pull-off near a barely used service road and hiked in about 5 miles until the trail faded out into the forest. There were no markers, no signs, just scattered trees and thickets in all directions. I checked the map and picked a direction that would bring me closer to the river. I figured I'd find a decent flat area to pitch the tent near the water. After about an hour of weaving through the trees, I found it. A small clearing, maybe 30 feet wide, surrounded by tall oaks and some younger sycamores, with just enough open space to see the sun through the branches. The river was about 200 yards downhill, the sound of it faint but steady. I set up camp there. It was beautiful. Nothing man-made in sight, just green and quiet all around. That first night, everything was calm. I boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal, sat back against a tree, and just listened. The sounds were simple and soft, wind through leaves, bugs, the occasional owl. I felt far away from everything. I turned in early and slept hard, only waking once when something rustled in the underbrush nearby, probably a raccoon or armadillo. I went right back to sleep. The next day I explored more. I followed the sound of the river, walked its banks for a mile or so, even waded in at one point to cool off. I saw no one. No footprints, no wrappers, no old campfire pits. Nothing to suggest anyone had been here in a while. That sense of isolation felt good. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found this little untouched pocket of woods. That evening, I ate again, filtered more water, and watched the last light fade through the trees. The sky went pink and then dark. Crickets took over the air. I crawled into my tent and listened to the forest settle for the night. I wasn't scared. I felt completely alone, and that was the point. Sometime in the middle of that night, I woke up. Not fully, just that half-awake state where something pulls you out of sleep. I didn't hear anything at first, just the usual chorus of insects. Then I noticed that it was quieter than it should have been. The crickets had stopped, or maybe I had just imagined they had. I stayed still, listening hard. A minute passed, maybe more. Then I heard something crunching, not far off. Leaves and twigs underfoot. Slow, uneven. It stopped. I waited. Nothing moved. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. But deer don't walk slowly like that, not usually. They either crash through or move quietly. This sounded like a person trying not to make noise. But who would be out here? There were no trails nearby, and I hadn't seen any other hikers in 2 days. I stayed frozen, hand on the knife next to my sleeping bag. I didn't make a sound. The crunching didn't come back. Eventually, I must have fallen back asleep. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing. A possum, a big raccoon maybe. Still, I checked around camp. No tracks, no signs of anything. My bear canister was undisturbed. The food was fine. Everything looked exactly the same. I felt silly for being nervous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching. I kept glancing over my shoulder all day. That afternoon, clouds started rolling in. A storm was forecast for the weekend, but I figured I had another day before it hit. I decided I'd pack up and hike back early the next morning. I didn't want to get stuck in the woods with wet gear. That evening, as I was cooking, I noticed something. A tree about 30 yards away had a mark on it. It wasn't there before, I was sure. I walked over and looked closer. The bark had been scraped away, not deeply, but enough to show the lighter wood underneath. 3 short lines, 1 long, scratched at chest height. It looked intentional, not an animal. I looked around, suddenly uneasy. Had someone been here? I stared into the trees for a long time, but they stared back with nothing. I stayed awake longer that night, sitting outside the tent with my flashlight on my lap, scanning the woods. I didn't hear anything at first. Then, maybe an hour after dark, I caught it again, movement. Just a flicker of shape between the trees. A flash of something pale, then gone. No sound. I kept my light on the spot for 10 minutes. Nothing. I didn't sleep well. Every snap of a twig jolted me up. I started hearing things I couldn't explain. Light clicking noises, like rocks tapping. Once, a soft thump, not far from the tent. I didn't dare go out and check. At dawn, I broke camp fast. I shoved everything into the pack, barely ate, and started hiking back the way I came. The forest felt different now, tight, watching. Every time I looked behind me, I thought I saw shapes between the trees, but nothing was there. After about 3 miles, I stopped to rest. I dropped the pack, drank water, and just stood still. That's when I noticed something off. The trail I thought I was on didn't look familiar. There was a dead log I didn't remember crossing before. I pulled out the map and compass. Somehow, I had veered west instead of north. Not by much, but enough to throw me off course. I adjusted and started again, cutting east to pick up the correct path. It should have been simple, but after an hour, nothing looked familiar. I didn't panic yet. I had water, food, and the map. Still, it felt wrong. The forest was dense here, overgrown, harder to move. Thorns tore at my arms. I checked the sun. It had shifted more than it should have. I was wasting time going in circles. Then I found it. Another mark on a tree. The same scratches, 3 short, 1 long. But this tree was deep in a different part of the woods, miles from the other one. There was no way it was the same tree. Someone had made another mark. That was when the panic started creeping in. I wasn't alone out here. I walked faster. I stopped checking the map as often. I just wanted to get out. That's when I heard it again. Steps behind me, matching mine. When I stopped, they stopped. I turned around. Nothing. I started running. Branches whipped me in the face. I didn't care. I just ran until I couldn't anymore. I dropped to my knees, gasping, heart pounding. I looked up and saw a small structure, a shack, old, weathered, half collapsed. It wasn't on the map. I approached slowly. The door hung open. Inside, broken furniture, trash, a rusted-out wood stove, and something worse, a wall with dozens of marks scratched into the wood. All the same, 3 short lines, 1 long. I backed out. That's when I heard the noise. Not steps this time, breathing. Close. Behind the shack. I didn't look. I ran again. I don't remember much after that. Just running, crashing through brush, falling, getting up, running again. My legs felt like fire. My chest felt like it was caving in. At some point, I found a dry creek bed and followed it. Hours passed. Eventually, I saw the gravel service road. The same one I had come in on. My car was there, untouched. I drove without stopping. Didn't care about the gear, didn't care about food. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station an hour north. I went inside, sat in the bathroom for half an hour just trying to slow my breathing. I didn't tell anyone the full story, just that I got lost. That part was true. I still hike, but I don't camp alone anymore, and I never go off trail. There's something about hearing footsteps behind you, matching yours exactly, that never leaves your head. There's something about seeing a mark on a tree that shows up again, miles away, as if someone wants you to see it. The scariest thing I've ever felt wasn't seeing a shadow or hearing a growl in the woods. It was realizing I was being followed, not by a bear, not by a ghost, but by another person. Someone quiet, patient. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip to clear my head. I was 34 at the time, living in Fort Collins, Colorado. I'd been laid off a couple of months earlier from a tech company and had just come out of a long-term relationship. I needed space, something to reset my brain. Nature always helped, and I wanted real solitude, not a campsite packed with tourists or RVs. So I looked up some quieter places up north, away from the usual spots, and found a relatively lesser-known patch of forest outside Pinedale, Wyoming. It was part of the Bridger Teton National Forest, but the area I picked was several miles off any marked trail. Not many people went that deep in. I planned everything carefully, packed enough food for 5 days, brought a solid tent, good sleeping gear, first aid, satellite communicator just in case, and even downloaded offline maps. I drove about 8 hours, passing through a few small towns and eventually hitting a dirt road that felt like it hadn't been touched in years. I parked at the end of the road where it faded into a narrow, rocky path. From there, I hiked another 2 hours, weaving through thick pine trees and up a low ridge until I found a small clearing. It was perfect, flat, dry, and surrounded by tall trees. There was a stream maybe 200 feet away, running fast with snowmelt. I set up my tent near a fallen log and got a fire going before dusk. The first night was peaceful. I sat by the fire, ate one of my freeze-dried meals, and listened to the quiet. It was the kind of silence you only find deep in the woods. No cars, no hum of electricity, just wind through the trees and the distant sound of rushing water. The second day, I spent hiking around the area. I followed the stream upstream for a while, saw some deer tracks, and even spotted a moose in the distance across a marshy opening. I didn't go too far since I wanted to make sure I could get back before dark. I collected some more firewood on the way back and took some time reinforcing the rain fly on my tent since it looked like clouds might roll in. I boiled water for dinner and sat in front of the fire again, letting my thoughts drift. Felt good, being disconnected. No phone buzzing, no pressure to talk to anyone, just the steady rhythm of being outside. It was that night, the second night, when things started to feel off. I woke up around 3 a.m., not because of any noise, but because I had the oddest feeling. You know when you suddenly wake up and your body feels alert, like something's not quite right? I lay there still, eyes open, listening. There was no sound at first. Then I heard something, a single snap, a branch or stick breaking somewhere nearby. Not the kind of soft sound you get when an animal brushes by. It was sharper, heavier. I stayed still, barely breathing, and listened. I heard another one, then nothing. I told myself it was probably just a deer moving through, maybe even an elk. They can be big and clumsy at night. I didn't hear anything else after that, so I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I stepped out and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. I circled the area slowly, checking for tracks, but the ground was mostly pine needles and dry leaves. If anything had been there, it didn't leave a clear trail. Still, I felt uneasy. I tried to shake it off and decided to stay close to camp that day. I collected more firewood, fished a bit in the stream, and kept glancing over my shoulder more than I usually would. That afternoon, I thought I saw movement up the ridge past the stream, maybe 300 feet away, a dark shape moving between the trees. I stared for a long time, waiting to see it again, but nothing moved. Could have been a bear, I thought, or even just shadows playing tricks. But I kept my bear spray on my belt after that. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up, checking my watch, listening to the forest. It was cold, too, colder than the previous nights. Around 2:30 a.m., I woke up again, this time to the sound of a dull thump, like something hitting the ground hard. Not right outside the tent, but not far. Then it happened again. A few seconds later, a third thump. I sat up quietly, reached for my flashlight, and stayed still. I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away my position or my presence. I waited. The noises stopped. The next morning, I walked in the direction of where I thought the sound came from. I scanned the forest for a while and eventually found something strange. A pile of broken branches and torn up moss, almost like something heavy had fallen or trampled through there. What struck me most was that it wasn't a random mess. It looked like something had deliberately cleared a space, or maybe something had been sitting there. The ground was flattened in a rough oval. No clear prints, just an impression. That area didn't feel right. I didn't stay long. When I got back to camp, I decided I'd cut the trip short and leave the next morning. I still had food and daylight, so I wasn't in a panic, but my instincts were telling me not to spend another night out here. I made a bigger fire that night. Something about the flames made me feel safer. I even kept the flashlight on my chest as I lay in the sleeping bag. I think I dozed off sometime after midnight. It was close to 4 a.m. when I woke up again. This time, I didn't need to hear anything. I felt it. There was something outside the tent. I didn't move. I listened, heart pounding, trying to pick up the slightest sound. And then I heard it. Breathing. Deep, slow breathing. Right outside the thin nylon wall of the tent. Not an animal snorting or huffing, but controlled breathing. Human. I froze. Every muscle locked up. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The breathing lasted maybe 10 seconds. Then I heard one slow step. Crunch of leaves. Another step. Then nothing. I stayed frozen for probably an hour. It wasn't until the faint blue of dawn lit the sky that I dared unzip the tent. There was nothing there. No person. No tracks. But something had been there. I packed up in record time. Didn't even bother making breakfast. I stuffed everything in my pack. Didn't care how neat it was. I had bear spray in one hand and a knife in the other as I hiked back to the car. When I finally reached the dirt road and saw my vehicle, I almost dropped to my knees in relief. But the unease didn't stop there. I walked around the car out of habit, and that's when I saw it. There were smudges on the rear window. Not handprints, but streaks, like someone had leaned against it or dragged something across. I checked the door handles. They were clean, but my gut told me someone had been near it. I got in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I was an hour south and had full cell signal again. I never reported it. What would I say? That someone followed me into the woods? That I heard breathing? No crime had happened, technically, but I know what I felt. I know I wasn't alone out there. For a while after that, I didn't go camping. Not alone, at least. The idea of being that isolated again made my skin crawl. Even now, years later, I think about that trip. I think about the sounds in the night, the flattened ground, the breathing, and I wonder who or what kind of person was out there with me. They didn't steal anything. They didn't confront me, but they wanted me to know they were there. And that's what still bothers me the most. They wanted me to know. I was 33 years old the summer I decided to take a break from everything and go camping alone in the mountains of western Colorado. It was July of 2017, and I just left a stressful job at a software firm in Denver. I wasn't in a rush to find a new one yet. I needed a reset. I'd always liked the outdoors and figured that a solo trip away from my phone, the city, and people in general might do me some good. No distractions, just quiet. I wanted to be uncomfortable on purpose, away from anything that reminded me of offices or meetings or traffic. I didn't even bring a fishing rod or a book. Just a pack, a tent, a good knife, food, and water. I picked a spot in the Flattops wilderness, about 3 hours west of Boulder. It wasn't one of the more popular parks, and I liked that. Fewer hikers, more room to breathe. I studied the trail map ahead of time and planned a 5-day loop that would take me through deep woods, past some alpine lakes, and up over a few passes. The trailhead was just past a small town called Yampa. From there, I'd hike about 9 or 10 miles in on the first day and set up near a stream I'd seen on the map. It took half a day to hike out to the spot. It wasn't hard, but I'd been indoors too long. My legs felt heavy by the time I got to the little valley where the stream curved between two tree-covered hills. There were no boot prints on the dirt, no broken twigs. I could tell nobody had been through here in a while. The nearest road was at least 10 miles away. I liked that. I set up camp on a flat patch about 30 feet from the stream, under a cluster of tall pines. I cleared away the pine cones and sticks and made sure no widowmakers were hanging above me. I'd done enough backpacking trips to know how to camp smart. The first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple dinner on my little stove and sat by the stream until it got too dark to see. No fires, too dry, and I didn't want to risk it. The air cooled off fast once the sun went down, and the stars came out in that sharp, cold way they only do when you're up high and far from town. I crawled into my tent and fell asleep listening to the water moving over rocks. The second day, I didn't hike far. I decided to stay in that valley another night. I followed the stream for a while, explored the area, and spent a long time just sitting in the shade. It felt like my thoughts were finally slowing down after years of nonstop work. I'd only seen one squirrel all day and heard a few birds, but otherwise it was quiet. I thought that was exactly what I wanted. That night, though, something woke me up. I wasn't sure what time it was, but it was dark. I had earplugs in, something I always used when camping, but I remember opening my eyes in the tent and immediately feeling wide awake. Something had pulled me out of sleep. I pulled the earplugs out and listened. At first, I didn't hear anything, just the stream. But then I noticed the crunch of something stepping on the pine needles just outside the tent. A single step, then nothing. Then another step. It wasn't an animal rustling. It was slow, deliberate, heavy. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I lay flat on my back, staring at the roof of the tent. My heart was pounding, and I felt this cold sensation roll over me. I reached quietly for my flashlight and my knife, both of which I kept in the corner of the tent near my sleeping bag. I held the flashlight but didn't turn it on. I just listened. There were no more steps, just stillness. But I knew something had been out there. After what felt like 20 minutes but was probably less than 5, I finally turned on the flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly. I scanned outside. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I stepped out barefoot, holding the knife in one hand and the light in the other, sweeping the beam around the campsite. No animals, no people, nothing moved. I walked in a wide circle around the tent, shining the light up into the trees and down along the ground. The pine needles were disturbed, but it was hard to tell if that was from me earlier or something else. I didn't see any footprints or scat. Eventually, I crawled back in the tent and lay there until the sky started turning pale. I didn't sleep again. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I packed up my camp and hiked out of that valley. I wasn't going to cut the trip short, but I didn't want to stay there another night. I pushed farther up the trail toward one of the alpine lakes on my map. The trail got steeper, and by mid-afternoon I was exhausted. My legs burned, and my shoulders ached from the pack, but I kept going. I didn't stop until I reached the lake, which sat in a rocky basin surrounded by spruce trees. I set up camp again, this time farther from the trail, closer to a boulder field near the edge of the lake. I tried to convince myself that what I'd heard the night before was just an animal, maybe a deer or an elk, but something in me didn't buy it. I'd heard deer walking before. This was different. That night, I stayed awake longer. I sat on a rock by the lake until the stars were fully out, scanning the edge of the woods every few minutes. Everything was quiet. Around midnight, I finally got into the tent and zipped it tight. I left my boots on this time and kept the flashlight and knife in my hands. I must have dozed off because I remember waking up again to that same feeling. Wide awake, alert. The air felt wrong. I didn't hear anything at first, but then I noticed something strange. The stream by the last camp had covered a lot of background noise. But here at the lake, it was dead silent. And in that silence, I could hear a faint, rhythmic sound, like soft thuds. Not footsteps exactly, maybe something being tapped against wood. Slow and steady. It was coming from somewhere just outside the tent, maybe 20 or 30 feet off. I froze again. My hand gripped the knife tighter. The flashlight was already in my other hand, but I didn't want to turn it on yet. I just listened. The sound stopped. Then it started again, a little closer. 4 or 5 taps. Then silence. My body was tense. I stayed like that for a long time. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to unzip the door again and shine the light around. Nothing, just rocks, trees, and black water. The next morning, I looked around the campsite in daylight. I walked a wide circle again, looking for anything out of place. Near a tree about 30 feet from the tent, I found something strange. 4 sticks laid in a row on the ground, thin, maybe a foot long each. They were placed too evenly to be random, all parallel, spaced about a foot apart. No tracks nearby, just those sticks. I didn't touch them. I left them there. I packed up again and started toward the next leg of the loop. This part of the trail crossed over a narrow ridge and dropped into another valley, even more remote than the first one. I didn't want to stay another night, but the loop was too long to finish in a single day, and the trail didn't allow for a quick way out. I had no signal, and the nearest access point was still 2 days away. I kept hiking. That night, I didn't set up a tent. I made a quick shelter against a rock wall and didn't clear a full site like before. I figured if something or someone was following me, I didn't want to leave signs of where I stopped. I didn't cook anything either, just ate a cold protein bar and drank water. I didn't sleep much. Every little sound in the woods felt like it could be footsteps. In the early morning, I decided to leave the trail entirely. I still had my compass and the map. I'd marked a few landmarks, and I figured I could bushwhack my way down toward a service road that ran east of the wilderness boundary. It would take me off course, but I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to be around people again. It was hard going. The brush was thick in places, and I had to move slower to avoid injury. I slipped a few times on loose soil and scraped my hands on sharp rock. Around midday, I saw something that made me stop cold. A tree stump about 20 yards ahead had a strip of bright blue cloth tied around it. I hadn't come this way before, and I definitely hadn't put that there. The cloth looked torn, like it had been ripped from a shirt or pack. It wasn't mine. I walked closer and saw that there were small carvings in the bark of the tree, lines and crosses, maybe symbols. Not fresh, but not old either. That told me two things. Someone had been in these woods recently, and they wanted to leave signs for something, or someone. I didn't touch the cloth. I moved past it and picked up my pace. My legs were sore, and my back felt like it was on fire, but I kept going. I didn't stop until it got dark. I found a small dry patch under a fir tree and stayed low. No light, no sound, just waited. I kept thinking I'd hear something behind me. Twigs snapping, leaves moving, but it never came. In the morning, I finally hit the old service road. It was overgrown but still visible. I followed it downhill for a few miles and came out near a campground that was actually occupied. I saw cars and smoke from a campfire, and I almost started crying. I didn't talk to anyone. I just walked past the campground, down to the main road, and waited until someone drove by and gave me a lift into town. I never figured out what exactly happened during that trip. I don't know if it was just a hunter messing with me, or a hermit living off-grid, or something else entirely. But I know I was being followed. The sounds. It was late September, the kind of time when the air starts to chill at night and the leaves turn to a mix of amber and gold. I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks, a break from the monotony of work and life. I had planned to go solo, as I often did. There's something about being out in the woods alone that's both peaceful and exhilarating. The silence, the crisp air, the endless expanse of nature around you. There's no substitute for it. I had chosen a spot in the Ouachita Mountains, a little off the beaten path. It wasn't a popular site, which is exactly what I wanted. There were a few campgrounds around, but I didn't like the idea of hearing other people's voices or having to share the space with strangers. I wanted to be alone. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few personal things like a journal and a book. I even brought a small hatchet, just in case I needed to chop some wood for a fire. The weather forecast had promised clear skies, with no rain expected, which was good news. The drive was longer than I expected. The winding roads through the mountains seemed to stretch on forever. I kept thinking that I should have left earlier, but by the time I got there, it was already late afternoon. The sun was hanging low, casting long shadows across the landscape. I parked my car at the edge of the trailhead, grabbed my gear, and started walking toward the site I had picked. The path wasn't exactly marked, but I had printed a map before I left and knew the area well enough from past trips. The deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it became. There were no other hikers, no sounds of civilization, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze, the occasional chirp of a bird, and the distant trickle of a creek somewhere off to my left. By the time I reached the spot, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, and the shadows were growing longer. I found a small clearing near the creek, perfect for setting up camp. There was a large fallen log nearby, which I decided would make a good place to sit once I got the fire going. I set up my tent quickly, the familiar motions comforting as I worked. Afterward, I gathered some wood from around the area, stacking it in a small pile near the fire pit. I didn't want to go too far from camp, since it was getting dark, but I had plenty of dry wood to keep the fire going for the night. As the fire crackled to life, I felt a wave of contentment wash over me. There's something magical about a campfire. The way the flames dance and crackle, how the warmth spreads through the cool air. I sat back on the log, eating my dinner and watching the fire burn. It wasn't until the night fully set in that I began to notice how truly silent it was. Usually, at night, you hear animals. Mice rustling in the bushes, the hoot of an owl, maybe even the distant howl of a coyote. But tonight, there was nothing. The silence was almost oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just the time of year. Animals tend to be quieter as the weather gets colder, especially as the days shorten. But as the hours passed, I began to feel more and more uneasy. The silence felt wrong, unnatural. I stood up, scanning the surrounding trees, half expecting to see something move just beyond the firelight. But there was nothing. The trees were still, the shadows deep. It wasn't until I went to bed that the unease really started to settle in. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling, listening to the faint rustle of leaves outside. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the quiet was just part of the night. But sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept drifting, thinking of things I hadn't thought of in years, replaying old memories like a broken record. I woke up around 2 a.m., a loud snap of a twig pulling me from sleep. My heart raced as I lay still, listening. There it was again, a distinct crunch of something heavy moving through the underbrush. It wasn't an animal. The sound was too deliberate, too human. I didn't want to think about it, didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I grabbed the hatchet from beside me, holding it tightly, my knuckles white against the wood. The minutes felt like hours as I lay there, straining to hear anything that might confirm my fears. But nothing came. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly sat up, my breath shallow and quick. I thought about turning on my flashlight, but then I stopped myself. I didn't want to give away my position. I needed to stay quiet, to wait until the morning light. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and sleeplessness. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I was exhausted, my eyes sore and red. I didn't waste any time. I packed up my camp quickly, shoving everything into my bag without much thought. The sense of urgency was overwhelming, my hands shaking as I worked. I wanted to get out of there, back to my car, back to safety. As I moved through the woods, every sound seemed amplified. Each rustling leaf, each snap of a twig felt like it was right behind me. I was sure I was being followed. But when I looked behind me, there was nothing. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had fully risen, casting the forest in warm morning light. I didn't feel any safer, though. The quiet still lingered in the air, and the unsettling feeling hadn't left. I hurried back to my car, nearly running the last stretch of the trail. When I reached the parking lot, I stopped for a moment, just breathing. My heart was still racing, but I was finally away from the woods. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at the trees, trying to make sense of what had happened. As I started the car and pulled out of the lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me leave. But the forest was empty. It wasn't until later, after I got home, that I truly realized what had happened. I went through my gear, checking everything over. When I got to my tent, I found something strange. A small muddy footprint near the entrance. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even close to the size of my boots. I didn't know who or what it had been, but I knew one thing for certain. Someone had been watching me the entire time, and that thought stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind long after I was home safe. The forest had been quiet, too quiet, but it wasn't the silence of nature. It was the silence of something or someone waiting. It wasn't until I went back through my photos from the trip that I noticed something odd. In one of the shots, just at the edge of the frame, I could make out a figure, a faint outline standing just inside the trees. It was barely noticeable, but it was there. I didn't go camping alone again after that. Something about that night, the silence, and the footprints, it stayed with me. Some things are better left unexplored, and I learned that lesson the hard way. The woods can be a beautiful, peaceful place, but sometimes you don't know what's out there, what's lurking just beyond your sight. I was 28 years old, and after months of being buried under work and stress, I needed a break. I had heard a lot of good things about a secluded campground near the northern edge of the Cascade Range in Washington state. It was supposed to be the perfect spot to disconnect, recharge, and reset. I didn't really expect anything extraordinary, just the quiet, solitude, and the peaceful hum of nature. What I didn't expect was to be thrown into a situation that would leave me questioning the safety of the wild, and whether some things are better left unexplored. I drove up there at the end of September. The trees had already started to change color, with shades of yellow, orange, and red stretching out over the landscape like a painting. The road to the campground wasn't easy to find. There were no big signs, and the last mile or so was a dirt path that wound through thick forest. I had been given directions by the camp host, a man who seemed friendly enough, but his eyes were a bit too intense, like he had been in the woods for too long. I reached the campground by late afternoon. It wasn't crowded, just the way I liked it. The few campers around were all spread out in their own sites, their tents small and discreet, blending into the scenery. I picked a spot far enough from the others, near the edge of a small, shallow creek. The site was perfect. It had a view of a small clearing where the sun filtered through the trees and danced on the leaves. The air was crisp, but not too cold. It was that perfect balance where you felt the outdoors, but the warmth of the day still clung to the atmosphere. I set up camp quickly, unrolling my tent and gathering firewood. The sun was beginning to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows over the campground. It was quiet, but in a way that made the stillness feel oppressive, like there was something on the verge of happening. After a while, I started a small fire, just enough to cook my dinner and keep me warm. The crackling of the flames and the chirping of the crickets were the only sounds. As night settled in, the forest seemed to come alive in different ways. The wind started to pick up, rustling the trees, and the distant calls of animals echoed through the forest. I sat by the fire, lost in my thoughts, trying to push away the strange feeling that had begun to creep up my spine. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt uneasy. The sense of quiet here wasn't the peaceful kind. It was more like a heavy silence that weighed on everything around me. I brushed it off as just nerves, the result of being alone in an unfamiliar place. My thoughts were interrupted when I noticed something in the distance, near the tree line on the far side of the clearing. A shadow moved, just a brief flicker. It was too fast to make out any details, and I quickly convinced myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or something else skittish. But the longer I stared, the more my unease grew. There was something unnatural about the movement. It wasn't the typical skittering of an animal, but something else, more deliberate. I tried to shake off the thought, standing up to stoke the fire, but as I did, the air shifted. The wind had stopped. The forest felt suffocating, as though all the life around me had suddenly gone still. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I scanned the tree line again, but whatever it was had disappeared. By the time I got into my tent and zipped it up, the sense of dread had grown heavier. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling of the tent, my mind racing with every possible explanation. I kept telling myself that I was overthinking it, but deep down, I knew there was something off about this place. I managed to fall asleep, but it wasn't restful. My dreams were strange, fragments of images that didn't make sense. I woke up several times throughout the night, heart pounding, convinced I heard something outside my tent. Every time I checked, there was nothing. No rustling, no footsteps, just the silence of the night pressing in. When morning came, the fog was thick. It clung to the trees and hung in the air like a blanket, muffling all sound. I was grateful for the sunlight that started to filter through the mist, though the forest still felt eerie. It was as if the fog was hiding something I couldn't quite see, but I could feel. I decided to go for a hike, hoping it would clear my head. I followed a trail that led deeper into the forest, hoping the physical activity would shake off the lingering sense of unease. The trail was narrow and winding, and the trees were densely packed together, their branches stretching out to create a canopy that blocked much of the sun. As I walked, I realized that the forest felt different from the others I had been to. It wasn't just that it was quiet, it was too quiet. There were no birds chirping, no sounds of insects buzzing. It was just still. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard not to feel like I was being watched. Every rustle in the leaves made me jump, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, to be following me. But every time I turned around, there was nothing, just trees and fog. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin deep in the woods. It was old, the wood weathered and cracked, and there was a faint smell of mildew in the air. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. I wasn't sure if I should go inside, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside cautiously, the floor creaking beneath my boots. The cabin was empty, save for a few pieces of broken furniture. It felt abandoned, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here recently. The air felt stale, as though it had been undisturbed for years, but I couldn't ignore the small details. A half-burned match on the floor, footprints in the dust. It was as if someone had left in a hurry. I felt my skin crawl. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a sound that made my heart stop. It was a soft thudding, like footsteps on the floor above me. I froze. The house was empty, I reminded myself. It was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But then it came again, louder this time. Thud, thud, thud. I bolted out of there, my heart hammering in my chest, and didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my camp. I didn't care how crazy it sounded, but I knew something wasn't right in these woods. That night, I decided I wouldn't stay any longer. I packed up my tent, my things, and started the long drive back to town. I didn't look back as I left the campground behind. The forest seemed to open up in a way that made it feel like it was breathing a sigh of relief. When I reached the main road, the fog began to lift. It was as if whatever had been lurking in those woods was finally behind me. I don't know what I encountered up there, but I know I'll never go back. Years later, I still think about that trip. I sometimes wonder what was in the woods, what I heard in that cabin. It's a question I'll never have an answer to. But there's one thing I do know for certain. Not every part of nature is as serene as it seems. Some places are better left undisturbed, and some things are meant to stay hidden. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in late September of 2021. I had taken time off from my job at a small landscaping company in Columbus, Ohio, and I wanted to get away from people for a few days. Things had been rough that year. Work had slowed down. My girlfriend and I had broken up in July, and I'd been in this weird headspace where I didn't want to talk to anyone. But I also couldn't stand sitting at home with the TV on, doing nothing. So I figured a few nights alone in the woods might help clear my head. I picked a place about 5 hours away from the city, in Wayne National Forest, southeast Ohio. It wasn't the most remote spot in the world, but it was far enough that I wouldn't run into many other people. I didn't want a campground or a marked trail. I wanted to be alone in actual nature, so I looked up some old logging trails that were barely used anymore and marked a spot on my phone's offline map. I packed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, basic food, stove, headlamp, a folding knife, water, and a backup filter, and left early one Thursday morning. The drive out was peaceful. I listened to music most of the way, stopping once for gas and a quick snack. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, cool but not cold. When I finally turned off the main road and onto a narrow dirt path that curved through thick woods, I could feel that weight in my chest lift just a little. The trees were tall, mostly maple and oak, and their leaves were just starting to turn. I rolled down my windows and let the smell of the forest fill the truck. Eventually, the dirt road thinned out into a rough trail barely wide enough for one vehicle. It was overgrown, with branches scraping the sides of the truck, but I kept going. I reached a small clearing around 3 p.m., just big enough to turn the vehicle around if I needed to. It looked like an old logging staging area that hadn't been used in years. I parked, grabbed my backpack, and locked the truck. I wasn't expecting anyone to come this far, but it was habit. From there, I hiked about 40 minutes into the woods, going mostly south by my compass and checking my map every now and then. The forest was thick but not hard to move through. The ground was mostly dry leaves and dirt, with little undergrowth. I found a good spot by a shallow creek, surrounded by trees, but with enough of an opening above that I'd get a little sunlight in the morning. I cleared the ground, pitched my tent, and started boiling some water for dinner. The first night was uneventful. I stayed close to camp, ate some instant rice and tuna, and watched the last light fade behind the trees. It got colder after sunset, but I had good gear, and once I was in my sleeping bag, I was warm enough. The forest was quiet, with just the usual nighttime sounds. Crickets, the occasional owl, a light breeze in the trees. I slept on and off but felt pretty rested in the morning. Friday, I decided to explore a bit. I kept my compass and map with me and marked my camp with some bright orange tape on a nearby tree, just in case. I hiked maybe a mile or two out in different directions, looking for interesting rocks or signs of wildlife. I didn't see much, just some deer prints, a few squirrels, and one raccoon that didn't seem to notice me. I brought a small day pack with water and snacks and made it back to camp by mid-afternoon. I collected some deadfall for a small fire and cooked a better meal that night. Some rice with canned beans and sausage. Tasted better than it should have. That night, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything loud or obvious. I didn't hear a scream or see anything crazy. It was more like this quiet shift in the air. I woke up around 2 a.m. because I thought I heard something walking through the leaves near the creek. I laid still for a few minutes, just listening. It was dead silent. No breeze, no animals, not even insects. Just this heavy quiet like the whole forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was probably a deer or raccoon and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I noticed something strange. About 20 feet from my tent, in the soft dirt near the edge of the creek, I found a single shoe print. It wasn't mine. I wore size 11 hiking boots, and this print looked smaller, maybe a size 9 or 10. It was deeper than mine, like the person had been standing still with all their weight on one foot, pointed toward my camp. The ground around it wasn't disturbed, just the one print. I stood there staring at it for a while, trying to make sense of it. Could have been from days ago, sure. Maybe someone passed through here recently before I arrived. But the forest floor was soft and covered in leaves. My own tracks barely held their shape after a few hours. This one looked fresh. I felt a slow unease creeping in. I walked a quick perimeter around my camp, scanning the ground, but I didn't find any other prints. Just the one. The rest of Saturday, I stayed close to camp. I didn't hike out like I'd planned. I read a paperback I'd brought, gathered more wood, and checked my gear. I had enough food and water for another day or two, but I started thinking about maybe heading out a day early. It was still peaceful and nothing had happened, really, but that feeling hadn't left. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing just inside the tree line. I never did. That night, I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I thought I heard movement again. Something faint, like a foot dragging through leaves. I turned off my light and waited. Again, the forest was dead silent. I stayed inside the tent, gripping my knife under the sleeping bag. I didn't hear anything else, but my body wouldn't relax. I finally drifted off sometime after 3 a.m., and when I woke up, the sun was already up. Sunday morning, I made the decision to leave. I packed everything quickly and kept scanning the trees while I worked. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, but I didn't fully believe it. I doused the fire pit, packed my trash, and headed north with my pack on my shoulders. That's when things got worse. I followed the same route I'd taken in. I recognized the terrain, the trees with old scars in the bark, a fallen log with moss growing only on one side. But after 20 minutes of hiking, I came to a spot that didn't make sense. There was a large, split boulder covered in green lichen that I didn't remember passing before. I checked my compass. North was still north. I checked the map. According to the distance I'd traveled, I should have been nearing the logging trail. But I wasn't. I tried to backtrack, but the forest started to feel unfamiliar. I couldn't find my orange tape marker. I couldn't even find the creek. I told myself to stay calm. I had water, I had food, and I wasn't lost, I just needed to reorient. But after another hour of hiking in a slow circle, I had to admit something was wrong. I wasn't just off course. I was somewhere I hadn't been before. I sat down, drank some water, and studied the map. I marked my best guess of where I was and decided to follow a northwestern route. That should have brought me back to the old road. The sun was out, and I figured I could follow its position if I lost my compass. But after another hour of hiking, I came across something that made my blood run cold. There was a tree, a tall birch with white bark, and tied to its trunk was a strip of bright orange tape, the same kind I'd used to mark my camp. But this one wasn't near the creek. It was in a part of the forest I hadn't been to. I stared at it for a long time. I hadn't come this way. I knew I hadn't. And yet, here was the same tape I'd used. I felt exposed, watched. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct in my body told me someone else was out there. Someone who had seen my camp. Someone who might have followed me. I didn't run. I kept moving, slower now, trying not to make noise. I took breaks behind thick trees and listened for movement. I stopped using the map. I just walked. I followed ridgelines downhill, hoping they'd lead me to a road or creek. By late afternoon, my legs were shaking from exhaustion. I hadn't eaten all day. Then I heard it, an engine. Faint, distant, but real. I pushed toward the sound, crawling over rocks and under low branches, until I saw it through the trees. A dirt road. My truck wasn't there, but I recognized the turnoff. I had come out nearly half a mile west of where I parked. I stumbled onto the road, heart pounding, and followed it back. It took another 20 minutes, but when I saw the blue paint of my truck through the trees, I nearly cried. The truck was untouched. Nothing in the bed had been moved. I unlocked it, threw my gear inside, and got in. I locked the doors and sat there for a while, just breathing. My hands were shaking. I didn't even start the engine for a few minutes. I just sat, listening to the ticking sound of the metal cooling in the late afternoon sun. When I finally started the truck and drove out, I didn't look back. I drove straight home and didn't tell anyone the full story for a long time. It sounded crazy, and I didn't want to hear someone try to explain it away with, maybe you just got turned around. But I didn't get turned around. I know that forest, and I know what I saw. Someone was out there. They saw my camp, left a footprint, maybe followed me. Maybe more than one person. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know if they were just trying to scare me or if it would have been worse if... It was the beginning of September when I decided to take a few days off to reconnect with nature. The idea had been lingering in my mind for a while. I was 29 years old and living in a small town called Evergreen Falls, a place known for its beautiful, untouched forests. I hadn't gone camping in years, and I needed a break from the chaos of everyday life. I wanted to experience some solitude, just me and the wilderness. I packed my gear early in the morning, making sure I had everything: a tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, food, and a first aid kit. I drove out of town and up into the mountains, following the winding dirt roads that led to the old camping site near Hollow Creek, a spot known for its peaceful atmosphere and its remoteness. I hadn't heard any stories about the area being dangerous, so it seemed like the perfect place to get away from it all. The sun was shining brightly when I arrived at the campsite, and the air was cool but not too cold. I picked a spot near the creek, where the sound of the flowing water was calming. Setting up camp was easy. I'd done it enough times as a kid, so I knew how to pitch a tent and arrange everything for comfort. Once my camp was ready, I spent a few moments just sitting by the creek, listening to the water and watching the birds flit between the trees. As the afternoon wore on, I decided to go for a hike. The forest around Hollow Creek was dense, filled with tall pines and thick underbrush. It was easy to get lost if you weren't paying attention, but I had a map and a compass, so I wasn't worried. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods, the ground soft beneath my boots. The trees towered above me, and the sunlight filtering through the canopy created a patchwork of light and shadow on the forest floor. I didn't expect to see many other hikers, which was part of the appeal of the place. It was isolated, and I liked the quiet. The only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the occasional rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. As I walked, I noticed the temperature dropping, even though it wasn't yet evening. The air was getting heavier, and there was an odd stillness about the woods. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. The trail took me further into the wilderness, and before long, I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing, there was an old, weathered cabin. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The roof had caved in on one side, and the walls were covered in moss and creeping vines. The wood had long since turned gray, and there was an unsettling silence surrounding it. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should go closer. The cabin seemed abandoned, and yet, something about it felt off. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, so I decided to explore it. I approached cautiously, stepping over fallen branches and trying to avoid the creaky floorboards that were visible through the cracks in the walls. Inside, the cabin was dark and damp. There was no furniture, just a few broken remnants of what might have once been a table or a chair. The floor was covered in layers of dirt and dead leaves, and the air smelled musty. I took a few steps further in, scanning the room for anything unusual. There was nothing of interest, just an abandoned building in the middle of nowhere. I started to turn around when I noticed something on the far wall. A faded, hand-drawn map was pinned to the wall, covered in strange markings. It looked old, maybe decades old. There were lines and symbols, some of which seemed to indicate a trail leading from the cabin to somewhere deeper in the woods. The map intrigued me, but it also unsettled me. Why was it here? Who had left it? I decided to leave the cabin, feeling a sudden urge to get back to my campsite. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was just the isolation, the eerie quiet of the place. I headed back the way I came, keeping the map in my mind but not dwelling on it too much. When I returned to my camp, the sun was beginning to set. I started a small fire, cooking up some canned beans and heating water for tea. The fire crackled, and the smell of the food filled the air. As I ate, I kept thinking about the cabin and the map, kept tugging at the back of my mind, like an itch I couldn't scratch. That night, after the fire had burned down to embers, I lay in my tent, trying to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I kept hearing strange noises coming from the forest. The wind had picked up, and the trees were groaning and creaking, but there was something else. Something that didn't quite fit. It sounded like footsteps, distant but deliberate, as if someone or something was moving through the woods just beyond my camp. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like a person walking, not the shuffle of paws or hooves. My heart started to race. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. I decided to take a look outside. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent slowly, careful not to make too much noise. The light from the flashlight cut through the dark, sweeping across the trees and the creek. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stood there for a moment, listening again, but the only sound I could hear was the wind rustling the leaves. I went back inside the tent, locked the zipper, and tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin in my mind, the faded map on the wall. It felt like there was something important about it, something I needed to understand. The next day, I packed up my camp, deciding to head home earlier than planned. I didn't want to risk staying out there any longer, not with the strange feeling that had settled over me. But as I was packing the last of my gear, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, soft, almost a whisper, coming from the direction of the cabin. It wasn't a clear voice, just a low murmur, like someone speaking in the distance. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't imagining it. I had heard it, unmistakably. But when I looked toward the cabin, I saw nothing. No movement, no sign of life. I quickly packed the rest of my things, eager to leave, but something made me stop. A strange compulsion, like I needed to go back to that cabin one more time. I grabbed the map from my bag and walked back through the woods toward the clearing. When I arrived, the cabin stood exactly as it had before, abandoned and silent. But when I looked closer at the map, I noticed something new. There was a symbol near the bottom that hadn't been there before, an X, marked in bold strokes, and beneath it, a line that led to a spot deep in the woods. I knew I should leave, but the curiosity was too much. I followed the line, my footsteps muffled by the forest floor. The air was thick, and the sounds of the woods felt distant, as if I had entered some other realm. The further I went, the more uneasy I became. Then I saw it, a small stone cairn, built carefully in the middle of the forest, and beneath it, a box. The wood was weathered and decayed, but it looked like it had been there for years, perhaps decades. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling. Inside was an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. I began reading, my eyes scanning the faded ink. The journal told the story of a man who had come to these woods many years ago, much like I had, seeking solitude. But his entry stopped abruptly. The last words scrawled across the final page were, "I should never have come here. They are still out there, waiting." I closed the box, my hands shaking. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it was time to leave. I turned and walked back to my truck, not daring to look back. When I got home, I burned the journal. The woods had already claimed enough. I went camping alone in the summer of 2022, in a forest preserve about 30 miles outside of Missoula, Montana. My name's Brian, and I was 27 at the time. I had been going through a rough patch. My girlfriend had broken up with me a few months before, and I was feeling drained from work. I'd spent too much time in front of screens and felt like I needed to get out and breathe for a while. I picked a quiet spot I found online, an unmaintained trail that ran deep into Lolo National Forest. Not many people went there, and that's exactly what I wanted. Just me, trees, and time. I packed light but carefully. I brought a new tent, a basic sleeping bag, my camp stove, and food for 3 days. Mostly trail mix, canned beans, some jerky, and granola bars. I carried a water filter and 2 full bottles, figuring I'd refill from one of the streams I saw marked on the topo map. I also brought a multi-tool, a flare, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, and my phone, even though I didn't expect a signal. I parked at the small gravel turnout where the trail began. It wasn't much, just 2 faded wooden posts and a nearly invisible path going into the trees. I signed the trail registry, tossing a quick note that I'd be back by Sunday afternoon. It was early Friday morning, just after 7 a.m. The sun was already warming the air, but in the shade of the trees, everything felt cool and damp. The trail started out easy. Pine needles softened my steps. I didn't hear much except the rustling of small animals and birds flitting around. A few squirrels darted past me. I walked steadily for about 4 miles until the forest opened up a bit, and I found a nice flat patch next to a stream. The water was flowing well, clear and cold. I took off my pack and sat on a mossy rock for a while, just listening. That part was peaceful. I could feel my thoughts slowing down, untangling themselves from all the noise I'd left back in town. I set up camp a little farther back from the water, under a patch of lodgepole pines. The ground was soft, dry, and even. I cleared away some sticks and dug a shallow trench around the tent just in case it rained. Felt good to work with my hands. After setting up, I made some lunch, jerky, and a granola bar, and lay back for a nap inside the tent. I woke up about 2 hours later to a distant sound. It wasn't loud, but it was different. Something like crunching, maybe footsteps on dry needles. I sat still, holding my breath, trying to listen. It stopped as suddenly as it started. I figured it could have been a deer or even a bear, but I had food sealed in scent-proof bags and hadn't left anything out. Still, I grabbed my bear spray and kept it nearby. The rest of the day passed quietly. I collected some dry wood for a small fire and boiled water for dinner. After I ate, I sat by the fire as the sky went orange, then pink, then dark. I didn't have cell service, which I expected, but I checked just in case. No bars. I turned my phone off to save the battery. The night air was cold and still. I crawled into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. I woke up again in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure why at first. It was pitch black outside. My watch said 2:14 a.m. I stayed still, listening. I heard something again. Not an animal sound, no growls or snorts or rustling leaves. This was slower, steadier. It sounded like something brushing lightly against my tent, then stopping. I didn't move. My heart was hammering in my chest. I reached slowly for the flashlight and clicked it on. The light made the tent fabric glow, but I didn't see any shadows or movement. I waited, breathing shallow, and after a while, I didn't hear anything else. Maybe it had just been a branch shifting in the wind, though I hadn't felt any breeze. I stayed awake for another hour, gripping the flashlight, before I finally drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around the tent. There were no tracks, no signs of animals or anything disturbed. I felt a little silly, honestly. Maybe I just freaked myself out. I spent most of the day hiking further down the trail, taking photos and filtering water. I found an old logging road that wasn't on the main map. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. I followed it for a little while, but I started to feel uneasy, like I was being watched. Couldn't shake it. The air felt heavier. Not dangerous exactly, just wrong. I turned back and made it to camp by late afternoon. Everything was where I left it. I ate quickly and cleaned up. I didn't light a fire that night. I wanted to stay low profile just in case. I lay in the tent with the flap zipped up and my bear spray beside me again. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up every hour or so. Around 3 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it wasn't brushing. It was a distant clicking sound. Slow, then faster, then stopping. Like metal tapping on something hard. It wasn't an animal. It didn't fit. It made no sense. I froze. I didn't dare turn on the light. I just waited. The clicking went on for maybe 5 minutes. Then nothing. No footsteps. No breathing. Just silence. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been some old trees shifting or a woodpecker. I tried to believe it. I forced myself to eat breakfast and packed a day bag to do one more loop. I left my tent up since I planned to spend one more night before hiking back to the car. I followed the same logging road again, but went a little further this time. I saw what looked like old tire marks, not fresh, but not ancient either. And about half a mile down, I saw a pile of trash. Not a lot, just some crushed cans, a broken lighter, and a rusted cooking pot. It didn't look like a regular campsite. There was no fire ring, no signs of shelter, just garbage. I didn't like the feel of it. Something about it felt wrong. I backed out and returned to camp early. That evening, I packed everything I could. I planned to leave before first light the next morning. I boiled water, ate my last can of beans, and went to bed early. I kept my flashlight in one hand the whole time. I didn't sleep much. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard something new, slow, deliberate crunching. Footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. I turned off the flashlight. My heart thudded so loud I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear my own breath shaking. Then nothing. No sound. No retreat. Just quiet. I stayed frozen, barely blinking. 5 minutes passed. 10. I never heard it walk away. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light came, I unzipped the tent, crouched low, and scanned the area. Nothing. No tracks. No trash disturbed. But I felt it. Something had been there. Watching. Waiting. I packed up everything in 10 minutes flat. I didn't eat. I didn't even check the map. I just got on the trail and started walking fast. After maybe 2 miles, I saw something on the side of the trail. It was a fresh boot print. Not mine. Too large. Sharp edges. And right next to it, a cigarette but still fresh. The tobacco inside looked dry. Someone had been there, following the trail after me, probably the night before. Maybe longer. That last mile felt endless. I kept checking over my shoulder, listening for footsteps. I even turned my phone on, hoping for a signal. Still nothing. Finally, I saw the trailhead. My car was there, untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and drove. When I got back into Missoula, I stopped at a gas station and called the local ranger station. I gave them the details, the trail name, the location of the trash pile, the footprints, the cigarette butt, and the weird noises at night. They took my statement and said they'd send someone out to check. That was it. A week later, I got a call back. The ranger said they found signs that someone had been camping illegally off the trail. No registration, no fire ring, just scattered trash and some knife marks on a tree. They didn't find the person, but they warned others not to camp alone in that area. I didn't ask for more. I didn't want to know. I haven't gone camping alone since then. I still get out into the woods sometimes, but only with friends and only on marked, popular trails. I still don't know who was out there. Maybe it was just someone squatting, or maybe worse. I don't care anymore. I made it out. That's all that matters. I still think about it when I hear branches snap in the dark or when the wind brushes a tent wall in just the wrong way. I never saw their face, never heard a word, but I know someone was there, and I know they were watching. I took a week off work in early September of 2019. I had been working nonstop that whole summer, managing inventory at a shipping warehouse in Minneapolis. When I finally got some time to breathe, I decided to drive up north to Wisconsin and spend a few days camping alone. I liked solo camping. No one to talk to, no one to wait on, no schedules or noise. Just the woods, the air, the dirt, and the quiet. I was 32 years old back then, in decent shape, and had been hiking and camping most of my life. I knew how to set up a shelter, handle wildlife, and read a map without needing a GPS. I liked going where there wasn't good cell reception. It made the experience feel more real. That year, I wanted to try somewhere new. I found a large stretch of public forest land near a small town called Black River Falls. It was national forest territory, and as long as you followed leave no trace rules and stayed off private property, you could pitch a tent pretty much anywhere. I drove out on a Wednesday morning, taking my old silver Subaru Forester with my gear packed neatly in the back. I stopped in town for gas and some last-minute supplies, extra batteries, an extra canister of fuel, and a new tarp. The weather was looking fine, low 70s during the day, 50s at night, no rain in the forecast. By mid-afternoon, I had made it several miles down a gravel forestry road and found a clearing just a couple hundred feet off the side. It wasn't an official campsite, just a spot where the grass opened up a bit under the trees. A mix of pine and hardwood, mostly oak and birch. I parked the car behind a thicket, unloaded my gear, and started setting up. My tent was a two-person Kelty, lightweight but tough. I pitched it on a slight rise to avoid pooling water in case the forecast was wrong. I set up my small gas stove on a flat rock, hung a food bag from a tall branch a good 100 feet away, and got everything ready before the sun started to go down. That first night went exactly how I hoped. I ate a warm dinner of canned chili and some bread, then sat in my camp chair with a little LED lantern and a paperback. I listened to the breeze move through the trees and watched the stars come out one by one. The air cooled off quick, but I had brought my thicker sleeping bag and layered up inside the tent. I fell asleep around 10:30 without much trouble. The only sounds were a few insects and the occasional rustle in the underbrush, probably raccoons or deer. The second day, I woke up around 7. My watch was still on my wrist. I made coffee, ate some granola, and walked a few miles down a narrow trail that seemed to follow an old logging road. It was beautiful. Early sunlight filtered down through the tall trees, and the ground was still damp from morning dew. I saw a few sets of tracks. Some deer, one that might have been a coyote. No people. That was part of the draw. I liked the sense that I was the only human for miles. I carried a day pack with a water bladder, a knife, a lighter, and some snacks. No gun. I didn't feel like I needed one. I'd been in the woods often enough to know that if you respected nature, it usually left you alone. When I got back to camp, nothing was out of place. Food bag untouched, tent exactly how I left it. I ate, read some more, walked to a nearby creek to wash up, and settled in again as the sun dropped behind the trees. Another quiet night. I was starting to feel fully relaxed. I remember thinking how great it was to be disconnected, to not hear a phone or see a screen or hear traffic for 2 full days. But that changed the next morning. I woke up earlier than usual, maybe around 5:30. It was still mostly dark outside, and the forest was quiet in a way that didn't feel right. I'd gotten used to the early chirping of birds, the bugs starting to hum, but this morning was dead silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. I stayed in my sleeping bag for a bit, thinking maybe I had just woken up at an off time, but the silence started to feel heavy. I got up, unzipped the tent, and stepped out into the cold morning. My breath fogged in front of me. Everything looked normal at first. The trees, the grass, the gear I had out. But then I noticed something small. There was a boot print near the fire pit that wasn't mine. It wasn't old, no leaves inside it, no washed out edges. It looked like a hiking boot, and it pointed straight at my tent. I crouched down and looked closer. It wasn't from the day before. The dew hadn't even disturbed it. It had to be fresh, from late last night or early that morning. I stood there for a long time, just listening and looking into the woods. I thought maybe it was a hunter, though there weren't any signs posted about that being legal there. Maybe someone had wandered through and kept going. Still, I hadn't heard anything, and the boot print was the only one I could find. No trail of steps leading to it or away. I checked the food bag, still hanging. I checked my car, still locked, no damage. I told myself it was probably nothing and tried to let it go. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That afternoon, I walked farther down the trail just to get some space. I kept checking over my shoulder. Every time I thought I heard a stick snap, I turned quick and stared into the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't stop feeling watched. It wasn't like the usual, I'm alone in the woods nerves. It felt more specific, like someone was hiding nearby, just out of view. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the lantern on low and stayed half awake, listening. Once or twice I thought I heard faint crunching sounds outside the tent, but they stopped when I sat up. I thought about calling it early and leaving the next morning, but pride kept me in place. I had done solo trips before and never had to cut one short. The next morning, though, I found something that changed my mind. When I went to grab my food bag, it was gone. The cord I had used to hang it was still there, tied tight to the branch, but the bag itself was cut free. Not torn, cut. A clean slice right through the nylon strap. I looked on the ground and found the bag about 15 feet away, emptied. The canned food was gone. So were the energy bars and anything edible. They hadn't just dumped it, they'd taken it. That was the moment I knew for sure that someone was messing with me. I packed up camp fast, threw my gear into the car without folding anything. I didn't care. I just wanted out of the woods. I kept checking the trees, looking for movement. I thought I saw a shaped duck behind a trunk at one point, but when I ran toward it, there was nothing there, just trees and silence. The road back felt longer than it should have. Every bend felt like a trap. Every shadow looked like someone crouching. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. I got back to town, found a gas station, and sat in the lot for nearly 20 minutes before I could focus enough to drive. Back home in Minneapolis, I tried to explain it to a couple friends, but I could tell they didn't quite get it. They figured it was a bear or maybe a lost hiker. But I know what I saw. Boot prints, clean knife cuts. My gear wasn't shredded like an animal had torn it apart. It was taken on purpose by someone. I reported it to the local ranger office, just in case, but I never heard anything back. They probably figured I was just spooked or making it up, but I wasn't. It's been a few years since that trip. I still go camping, but not solo anymore. Not deep like that. I stick to places with other people around, designated campsites. I always bring a satellite communicator now, and I lock my food up in a bear canister, not a tree. The woods are still beautiful, still peaceful, but I don't look at them the same way. I know how to listen now. I know what real silence sounds like. And I know the difference between being alone and being watched. That trip taught me something I won't ever forget. Sometimes, the scariest thing in the woods isn't a bear or a storm or getting lost. Sometimes it's knowing that someone else is out there too. Someone who doesn't want to be seen, and who's already gotten closer than you'll ever realize. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a solo camping trip out to the Flathead National Forest in Montana. I was 31 at the time, living in Billings, and working a stressful job at a distribution center. Things had been tense for months, and I'd hit my breaking point after a long week of back-to-back shifts and never-ending emails. I didn't even ask for time off. I just told my supervisor I needed a few days and drove off the next morning. I packed light: tent, food, water, some survival gear, and my backpack. I brought a map and compass, too, since I didn't want to rely on GPS out in the woods. I had camped before, mostly with friends or family, but this would be the first time I was truly alone in the wilderness. I wasn't scared, at least not at first. I actually looked forward to the silence. No cars, no ringing phones, no one talking at me. Just trees, fresh air, and time to clear my head. I drove out early on a Thursday morning, taking smaller roads that twisted through pine-covered hills and valleys. I'd picked a spot not too far from a remote logging road, a few miles from a lake called Birch Hollow. I had read that it was rarely visited, even in the summer. It seemed perfect, quiet, private, untouched. By the time I parked my truck off the side of the narrow dirt road and hiked a couple miles in, the sun was already dipping behind the tree line. I found a spot near a stream, flat and shaded, and set up my tent. The air was cool and smelled like wet moss and pine needles. I gathered some wood, started a small fire, and heated up a can of chili. I remember sitting on a log, eating slowly, watching the flames dance in the dark. The sounds of the forest at night were soft, just the trickle of the stream and the occasional rustling leaves. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The next day, I wandered the area. I didn't hike far, maybe a couple miles in each direction, just getting a feel for the land. The terrain wasn't too steep, but it was dense. A mix of fir and spruce, ferns, thick underbrush. I followed the stream upstream until it widened into a shallow pool where I washed my face and refilled my water bottles with my filter. I saw deer tracks in the mud and heard something big moving through the trees, but I never saw what it was. Probably an elk, maybe even a moose. The second night, I started to notice small things that felt a little off. Nothing major, just details. The firewood I had stacked seemed to be moved. I thought maybe I just didn't remember how I left it. Then I noticed that one of my socks was missing from the line I'd strung between two trees. I assumed the wind took it or some small animal dragged it off. That night, the woods felt quieter than the night before. Not silent, just muted. On the third day, I hiked further west, trying to reach the ridge I'd seen on my map. I didn't make it. A few miles in, I found a broken trail. Looked like it hadn't been used in years. Something about it felt strange. The trees around it were scarred, like bark had been stripped from them. There were claw marks on one, high up, too high for a bear unless it was standing. I looked for tracks but didn't see anything fresh. I turned back before I hit the ridge. I had this gnawing feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, but I still cut the hike short. When I got back to camp, I felt relieved. I started a fire early, cooked dinner, and tried to shake the unease. I remember checking my gear twice that night, making sure everything was where I left it. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of snapping branches. Not small ones either. It was distant but loud, and it didn't sound like an animal just passing through. It sounded heavy, deliberate. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. I didn't move for what felt like an hour. The sounds faded eventually, but I couldn't fall back asleep. The next morning, I found fresh prints near the edge of my campsite. Bare footprints, human. No shoes. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, with thick toes. At first, I thought maybe I was mistaken. Maybe they were distorted animal prints, but the stride was too narrow and even, and there were no claw marks, just toes and heels clear in the damp soil. They circled my tent and disappeared back into the trees. I packed my gear in a panic. I was ready to leave. I didn't even cook breakfast. I shoved everything into my pack and doused the fire. The trail back to my truck wasn't long, but it felt endless. Every sound in the woods made me jump. Birds flying off, squirrels running through leaves, distant creaks of old trees. I felt eyes on me the whole way out. When I got to where I parked, my truck was still there, untouched. I tossed my pack in the bed, slammed the door shut, and turned the ignition. The engine started, but I couldn't get out fast enough. I drove until I reached the next town and checked into a motel without even showering. I should have left it at that. I should have just moved on. But later that week, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. They stuck in my mind like a splinter. I tried to convince myself it was another hiker, maybe someone camping illegally. But why barefoot? Why sneak into my campsite and not take anything? Why walk circles around my tent in the middle of the night? I went online looking for stories from that part of the forest. There weren't many, just a few mentions in old forums, talk of strange noises, missing pets from nearby properties, and one post from 2011 by a guy who said he found a pile of animal bones arranged in a circle near Birch Hollow. He had photos too. The bones were clean and white, like they'd been picked over. He never responded to any of the replies on his thread. A few weeks later, I tried to forget about it. But one night, I came home to find a muddy footprint on my back porch, barefoot wide, the same shape as the ones I saw in the woods. I live alone. No one should have been there. My house is on the edge of a neighborhood, close to a wooded lot. I didn't report it. I just cleaned it off and installed cameras around my property. For a while, nothing happened. Then a month later, the motion camera picked up someone standing just inside the tree line behind my house. Just standing. Still. It was night and the image was grainy, but you could see the outline of a person. No shoes, broad shoulders. I didn't sleep that night. I called the police the next morning, but there was nothing they could do without evidence of a crime. That was the last time I saw anything. I ended up moving the following spring. I took a job in Spokane and rented an apartment downtown. No more woods, no more camping, no more living near the edge of anything. I haven't been back out into the forest since. I sold my camping gear, donated the tent, got rid of the maps. I think what unsettled me the most wasn't that someone was out there. It was that whoever it was didn't try to hurt me, didn't try to rob me, didn't speak or reveal anything. They just watched, walked in circles, let me know quietly that I wasn't alone. I still think about it, though. Every time I see a wooded area, every time I hear a branch snap at night, I think about how long that person might have been out there, living in silence, avoiding the world. I wonder how many others he watched before me, and I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for the next person to camp too far from the road. But I also learned something important from that trip. Nature doesn't always welcome you. It doesn't always give you answers. Sometimes the forest doesn't want you there, and when it doesn't, you leave. Not because of fear, but because of respect. Because something older, something quieter is already there, watching, listening, and sometimes just being watched is enough to change everything. It was the summer of 2017, and I had just turned 34. I'd been living in Portland for a few years and felt like I needed a break from the noise of the city. Work had been draining lately, and I hadn't taken time off in months. I wanted to get away from everything, my phone, my emails, even people. So I decided to go camping alone for the first time in years. I used to do it more often when I lived in Montana, but life had gotten in the way. I picked a place about 4 hours south of Portland, deep in the Umpqua National Forest. There was a remote lake called Birch Hollow Lake I had heard about from a hiking blog. It wasn't part of any official campground, which was exactly what I was looking for. The blog said it had no cell service, no crowds, no real trails going all the way to it. Just an old fire road and some light bushwhacking for the last half mile. It sounded perfect. I packed light but enough to last 3 days. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, some food, a small cooler with a bit of ice, my hatchet, 2 knives, bear spray, and a few changes of clothes. I filled my backpack with what I needed and drove out early on a Friday morning. By noon, I had turned off the main road onto a long, narrow dirt track with deep ruts. It was slow going, and I had to stop twice to clear fallen branches. I finally reached the spot where I had to park, an open clearing with a few old fire rings. I locked up the truck, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started down the narrow path. The hike wasn't too hard, but it got overgrown near the end. I followed some animal tracks where the trail disappeared, brushing aside ferns and tall grass until I heard the water. Birch Hollow Lake looked exactly like the photo from the blog. It was small, surrounded by tall trees, and completely still. No boats, no signs of people, no wrappers or beer cans on the ground. It felt untouched. I walked along the northern edge and found a spot under some pines where the ground was flat and covered in dry needles. I pitched my tent there, made a small fire ring out of rocks, and unpacked my things. The first day went by easily. I cooked some ramen over the stove, watched the lake ripple, and carved a stick just to keep my hands busy. I went to sleep early with the sounds of the woods around me. Crickets, frogs, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The next morning, I woke up around 6 a.m. to light coming through the tent. It was quiet, just the wind through the branches. I made some instant coffee and wandered around the lake for a bit. I saw deer tracks in the mud and a few blue jays overhead. It was peaceful. I spent most of the day reading and writing in a small notebook I had brought. I even swam in the lake for a bit. The water was cold but clean. That night was when things started to feel off. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just steady, like crunching. At first, I thought it was a deer. I lay there in my sleeping bag, still listening. It sounded like footsteps, slow and careful, just outside my tent. I reached for the hatchet I kept next to me and stayed quiet. The steps moved past the tent, then stopped. I didn't hear breathing. I didn't hear anything else. Just that silence that somehow feels heavier than noise. After a few minutes, the steps moved away toward the trees. I waited another half hour before unzipping the tent and stepping outside. I had my flashlight and scanned the woods. I didn't see anyone. I looked at the ground, but the dry pine needles didn't show much. No prints. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat by the fire pit and kept it going until sunrise. I tried to brush it off the next morning. Maybe it was an animal, maybe even my imagination, but I'd been camping enough times to know what normal sounds were. This wasn't a raccoon or a curious deer. It was a person, someone trying to be quiet. I decided I'd pack up and leave that evening instead of staying another night. I didn't feel safe anymore. I spent the day doing small things to pass the time. Refilling my water bottle, tightening up my gear, cleaning up my sight. I kept my bear spray on my hip and my knife in my pocket the whole time. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Around 4 p.m., I heard a noise from across the lake, like someone slipping on rocks. I turned and stared, but there was nothing there. Then I noticed something strange near a fallen log on the other side of the lake. A dark shape that hadn't been there before. I stood there watching it, not moving. It wasn't a shadow. It was something lying down. After a few minutes, it shifted. Whoever it was had been lying flat, watching me. That was enough. I grabbed my gear and packed fast, skipping dinner and shoving everything into my bag. I didn't even fold the tent, just stuffed it into its sack. I started heading back toward the trail, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. It was about a mile back to the truck. The woods felt thicker this time. Every snap of a twig made me stop and turn. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was pounding hard in my chest. Halfway back, I heard something behind me. Not close, but not far either. I sped up. I didn't run, but I wanted to. When I finally reached the clearing where my truck was parked, the relief hit me like a wave. But then I saw something that made my stomach twist. There were fresh footprints in the dirt around my truck. Deep ones, like someone had been pacing or circling it. I hadn't parked near any kind of trail, and there weren't any other tire marks. These prints were fresh. Some were still crisp on the edges. I looked around the clearing but didn't see anyone. I got into the truck, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, just breathing. I turned the engine on and backed out. As I pulled onto the rough track, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the trees, near where the clearing ended, I saw a figure. Person, standing still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I drove the rest of the way in silence, gripping the wheel tight. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station near Roseburg. I parked under the lights and sat there for a while. I used the payphone to call my brother, even though it was late. I didn't tell him everything, just said I'd had a weird time and decided to leave early. When I got home, I cleaned my gear and put it away. I didn't sleep much that night. For weeks after, I kept thinking about it. Those slow footsteps around my tent, the figure lying across the lake, the footprints near my truck. Someone was out there and they had seen me arrive. They had watched me sleep, walk, eat, and pack. They had gotten close, closer than I ever want someone to be in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't just the danger of it that stayed with me. It was the unknown part. I never figured out who it was or what they wanted. I didn't go to the police because I had nothing to give them. No face, no confrontation, not even a crime. Just fear and signs of someone being there. After that, I didn't camp alone again. I still hike and I still love the woods, but I always go with someone now. I always tell someone exactly where I'm going, and I always carry more than just a knife. The scariest part wasn't the footsteps or the figure. It was the planning behind it. That person had waited, watched, maybe even followed me. They didn't rush in. They were patient, and that's what makes me think they'd done it before. The first time I saw the cabin, I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease. It wasn't that the place looked particularly creepy. In fact, it was the opposite. The cabin stood in a quiet, serene spot deep in the woods, about 2 hours away from any major city. There were no other houses nearby, just trees and the soft murmur of a distant stream. Everything about it was picturesque, almost to a fault. But there was something unsettling about the isolation. The kind of isolation that makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world. I had rented the cabin for the weekend. Just me, a break from my work in the city, and a few books I'd been meaning to read. I needed the time to clear my head. Life had been stressful lately, with long hours at the office and endless emails. A weekend in the woods seemed like the perfect way to recharge. I was in my mid-30s. No real plans, no family to worry about, and a need to escape. So when I stumbled upon this rental, I booked it on impulse. The drive there was long, but I didn't mind. The roads narrowed, and the trees seemed to grow closer the further I went. The GPS lost its signal at some point, but I wasn't concerned. The road was rough, barely a trail, but my old SUV handled it well. I passed a few small cabins along the way, but they seemed abandoned or empty, which only added to the eeriness of the landscape. There were no people around, not a single car parked along the roadside. I figured it was just too remote for most folks. When I finally arrived, the cabin was waiting. It wasn't much to look at. A small, wooden structure with a rusty tin roof, a porch with a swing, and a single window facing the woods. The paint was chipped, and the wood looked weathered, but it was exactly what I had imagined. A quiet, rustic retreat. The surrounding forest was thick with pine trees, and the air had that clean, earthy smell that you only get when you're far from the noise of the world. I parked the car and got out. The silence was almost deafening. There were no birds, no breeze, not even the hum of distant traffic. I didn't think much of it at the time. It felt like a place I could lose myself in, somewhere far removed from everything. I grabbed my backpack and went inside. The interior was exactly as I expected. Simple and modest. A wooden table in the center of the room, a fireplace on one wall, and a small kitchen tucked to the side. The furniture was old, but in decent condition. A few chairs around the table, a couch by the fire. Nothing extravagant, just the basics. I was here to relax, not to indulge in luxury. I settled in, unpacked my things, and made myself comfortable. The first evening passed peacefully. I read for a while, made a simple dinner, and spent some time staring out the window at the darkening woods. There was a slight chill in the air, but the fire in the hearth kept the cabin warm. I was about to turn in for the night when I heard a sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling the trees, but then I heard it again. A soft, rhythmic thumping noise, almost like footsteps, but slow and deliberate. I froze. My heart started racing. I got up slowly and moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The beam of the porch light illuminated a small area around the cabin, but beyond that, the forest was shrouded in darkness. I saw nothing, no movement, no shadows. The trees swayed in the wind, but that was it. I stood there for a while, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. Maybe an animal or just the wind playing tricks. But the noise continued, faint but unmistakable. I checked the door, locked. I checked the windows, all sealed tight. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise seemed amplified in the stillness of the cabin. Every creak of the floorboards, every snap of a twig outside, kept me on edge. I kept imagining someone out there, hidden in the shadows, watching. The next morning, I tried to brush off the previous night's unease. I went for a walk in the woods, hoping to clear my head. The sun was out, filtering through the trees, and the air was crisp and cool. The forest around the cabin was thick with tall pines, the ground covered in fallen needles. I could hear the sound of a stream nearby, and birds were starting to wake up, chirping in the distance. The place felt almost too perfect, like something out of a movie. I wandered for hours, trying to shake the sense of discomfort that had followed me since I arrived. I didn't see anyone, but something about the silence, the solitude, made me uneasy. I was used to being alone in nature, but this felt different, like I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the beauty of the surroundings, but the feeling lingered. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it when I left that morning. My stomach twisted. I cautiously stepped inside, scanning the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt heavier, like it had been disturbed. I went straight to the window and checked the area outside. There was no sign of anyone, no footprints in the dirt, no movement. I tried to push the feeling aside. I was probably just being paranoid. I was alone out here in the middle of nowhere. It made sense that I'd be a little on edge. But as the evening rolled around, the strange noises started again. This time, they were louder. I sat in the living room, my book open in my lap, trying to concentrate on the words. But the sounds outside were getting harder to ignore. The thumping, slow, methodical. It wasn't an animal. I could tell. There was something deliberate about it. I went to the window and looked outside. The forest was pitch black, the trees casting long shadows in the moonlight. There was nothing but the sound. I grabbed the flashlight I had in the corner and stepped outside. The air was cold against my skin, and the ground was soft underfoot. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating the area around the cabin. And then I saw it, a set of footprints in the dirt, leading away from the cabin and into the woods. They were fresh. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. Who was out there? I hesitated, then followed the footprints. The beam of my flashlight bounced ahead of me, but the deeper I went into the forest, the more the shadows seemed to close in. The woods were unnervingly quiet now. No animals, no wind, just the sound of my breathing and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The footprints led me to a clearing. I stood there, scanning the area when something caught my eye, a small wooden figure lying in the grass. I walked over to it and knelt down. It was crude, carved roughly into the shape of a fox, its eyes too large, its mouth twisted into an unnatural grin. It was odd, unsettling. I picked it up, inspecting it closely. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the trees. I wasn't alone. I dropped the carving and bolted back toward the cabin, adrenaline surging through me. The footsteps were behind me now, closer. I could feel someone or something following me. I reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked it quickly, pressing my back against the wood. The noises outside stopped, and then I heard something else, a soft tapping, like fingernails on wood, coming from the back of the cabin. The cabin in the woods wasn't anything special. At least that's what I told myself when I first saw it. It was just a small, old place that sat on a patch of land somewhere outside of town. I had rented it out for a weekend getaway, hoping to escape from the grind of work and everything else. My name's Alex, by the way. I'm 32, and I'd been working non-stop for the past few months. A break seemed like the perfect solution. So, when I found the listing for a little cabin nestled deep in the forest, I jumped on it without much thought. I drove out to the cabin on Friday afternoon. The drive took longer than I'd expected, especially since I had to navigate a few dirt roads and avoid some potholes. It was pretty quiet, but that didn't bother me. I liked the peace, the solitude. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked exactly like the pictures online. Old, with a lot of wood, the kind of place that felt stuck in time. There was a porch swing that creaked in the wind, and the air smelled of pine and earth. There was no one else around for miles, which was perfect for me. The first night was peaceful. I unpacked my things, made a quick dinner, and spent a little time reading before going to bed. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, and that was fine. I didn't need it. I lay there in bed, listening to the sounds of the forest. The wind rustling the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the snap of a twig in the distance. It was all a bit eerie, but I was used to being alone in quiet places. I tried not to think too much about the strange noises, telling myself it was probably just animals or the house settling. The second day started out like any other. I woke up early, made some coffee, and took a walk around the property. The forest was dense, and the trees seemed to close in around the cabin. The woods were beautiful in their own way, but there was something unsettling about the way the sunlight barely made it through the thick canopy above. I pushed the feeling aside and went about my day. Around noon, I decided to explore further into the forest. I had no specific destination in mind, just a vague desire to get lost in the woods. I grabbed a backpack, packed some water, and headed out. The deeper I walked, the more isolated I felt. The sounds of the outside world faded until the only noise was my own footsteps and the occasional bird call. It wasn't long before I realized I had wandered far from the cabin. I stopped to take a break, sitting on a large rock beside a small stream. The water was clear, and the air felt cooler here, like the forest was protecting its secrets. I had no idea how much time had passed. When I stood up to leave, I noticed something strange, a slight shift in the atmosphere. The forest around me seemed quieter. The birds had stopped singing, and the breeze had died down. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. I shook it off and turned to head back, but something stopped me. There, on the ground, half hidden by a patch of moss, was a small wooden carving. It was crude, maybe a foot long, shaped like a small animal, a fox maybe, with exaggerated features. It wasn't something I would have expected to find in the middle of nowhere, and it unnerved me. I picked it up, studying it for a moment. It looked like it had been carved by hand, but the details were odd, almost unsettling. The eyes of the fox were too large, too hollow, and the mouth seemed to curl up into a twisted smile. I didn't want to believe it, but it felt as though the carving was looking at me. I shoved the carving into my backpack and began to walk back to the cabin. The forest didn't feel quite the same anymore. It felt like I wasn't alone. When I returned to the cabin, I put the carving on the table, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had crept over me. I couldn't explain it. Everything about the place felt just a little off, but I didn't want to let my mind get the best of me. I lit a fire in the fireplace, made dinner, and settled in for the night. That night, things got worse. I woke up in the middle of the night to a sound that I couldn't ignore. It was a soft thumping, almost rhythmic, coming from outside. My heart began to race. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal or the wind, but it didn't stop. It was consistent, like footsteps, slow but deliberate, moving around the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the night, revealing nothing but the trees, swaying in the wind. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound continued. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was someone else staying nearby, though I hadn't seen another cabin for miles. I tried to focus on the fire in the hearth, the warmth, but the noise kept coming. I stayed awake, my nerves on edge. Every time the sound stopped, I thought I could finally relax, but then it would start again, closer this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, watching. Around 3 in the morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my jacket and decided to investigate. I opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. The sound stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything was still. The only thing I could hear was the beating of my own heart. I walked around the cabin, shining my flashlight in every direction. The beam flickered as I moved it, catching glimpses of trees, rocks, and the odd shadow, but nothing else. That's when I heard it. A faint scratching sound coming from the back of the cabin, just behind the shed. It was faint like nails on wood. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't sure if it was fear or curiosity that drove me to go back there. My mind raced as I rounded the corner, shining the flashlight into the darkness. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but it was gone before I could focus on it. I moved closer, my breath coming in shallow bursts, trying to calm myself. There was nothing there, no one, just the quiet of the forest. I turned back toward the cabin, only to see something that made my stomach drop. The door, which I had locked earlier, was wide open. My heart skipped a beat. I rushed back to the cabin, but the door was just as I had left it. It was locked. I could hear the faint sound of something shifting inside. I didn't want to go in, but I knew I had no choice. I slowly opened the door, the wood creaking under my hand. The interior was the same as before, empty, still, and quiet. But something wasn't right. The air felt thick, like it was holding something back. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than they should have been. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room, and that's when I saw it. The carving, the one I had found earlier, was gone. It was no longer on the table. My heart pounded as I searched the room. I couldn't find it anywhere. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. But that didn't make sense. I had seen it only hours before. I stood frozen, my mind racing, trying to figure out what was happening. And then it hit me. The cabin wasn't empty. I wasn't alone. I ran out of the cabin, not looking back. I grabbed my backpack and didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove back to town in a panic, not caring about the road or the dark. I never went back to that cabin, and I never told anyone what happened. But I still remember it all, those footsteps, the carving, and that feeling that something was just out of sight, waiting. I've always been someone who needed peace and quiet. The hustle of the city life, the constant noise, the crowded streets. It all wore me down. That's why I rented the cabin. It was supposed to be a quiet, secluded getaway. A break from everything, a chance to breathe, to clear my mind. I found the cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains, not far from Asheville, North Carolina. The listing said it was tucked away in the woods, a perfect place to unplug and get some solitude. The pictures looked beautiful. An old rustic cabin with a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and a view of dense forest that stretched for miles. No neighbors for miles, no one around for at least a half-hour drive. I thought I was getting exactly what I wanted. I arrived around mid-afternoon on the first day. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, full of bumps and twists. It wasn't paved, and the trees overhead were thick, blocking out most of the sunlight. But it was peaceful, quiet, almost too quiet. There was no sound of cars or people, just the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of a bird. The cabin itself was old, as expected. The wood had a weathered look, the shingles on the roof were worn, but it had character. A small porch with a rocking chair greeted me as I walked up to the door. I could already feel the weight of isolation settling in. This was what I had wanted, after all. Inside, the cabin had a small living area with a stone fireplace, a couch, and a worn coffee table. The kitchen was tiny, but functional, with a gas stove and a small fridge. The bedroom was simple. A queen-size bed covered in a thick, plaid comforter. The wood floors creaked under my feet as I walked through the rooms. I liked it. It felt authentic, untouched by the modern world. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted a break. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking and settling in. The cabin was comfortable enough, but there was a certain stillness in the air that made me uneasy. It wasn't the kind of peaceful stillness I'd imagined. It felt heavy, like something was watching, but I shrugged it off. It was probably just my mind getting the best of me after the long drive. That evening, I decided to explore the area. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. I grabbed my jacket and went outside, taking in the fresh air. The woods surrounding the cabin were thick with trees, pine, oak, and birch, and the ground was covered in a layer of fallen leaves. I walked a little ways into the forest, just far enough to get a sense of my surroundings. Everything was still. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of branches. It was beautiful in its own way, but there was something unsettling about it. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it felt too quiet. I decided to head back to the cabin before it got too dark. The woods were nice, but they also felt too isolating. As I turned to head back, I heard something, a faint sound, like something brushing against a tree. It was soft at first, barely noticeable, but it grew louder. I paused and listened. There it was again, a scraping sound, like something or someone was moving through the trees. My heart skipped a beat. I turned around quickly, scanning the trees behind me, but I saw nothing. The forest was still. No movement. I shook my head. It was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I hurried back to the cabin, trying not to let my imagination run wild. That night, I tried to relax by the fire. I cooked a simple meal, nothing fancy, just some pasta and vegetables, and ate in silence. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees were beginning to sway. The sound of the wind against the cabin was comforting in a way, but there was also a sense of foreboding about it. I went to bed early, exhausted from the drive and the hike, but I didn't sleep well. Every little sound seemed amplified. The wind howling through the trees, the occasional creak of the cabin. Everything seemed so much louder in the dark. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard something else. It was faint at first, but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching through the leaves outside. My breath caught in my throat. I lay there in the dark, straining to listen. Couldn't move, couldn't speak. The footsteps were getting closer. My mind raced. Was it someone? A hiker, maybe? But who would be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? The footsteps stopped. Dead silence followed. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed still, barely breathing, hoping it was just the wind or an animal. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of something or someone scraping against the side of the cabin, like fingernails dragging along the wood. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window. There was nothing. Just the blackness of the forest stretching out in every direction. My breath came out in short, shallow gasps. I was sweating now, the air thick and suffocating. I couldn't stay in the cabin, not after that. I grabbed my flashlight and a jacket, hurriedly packing my things. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I had to get out of there. I opened the door slowly, peering into the dark night. Everything was still, too still. I stepped out onto the porch and looked around, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. The woods were silent. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something felt wrong. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get in the car and drive away as fast as I could. But I couldn't leave, not without knowing who or what was out there. I took a few steps into the yard, my flashlight swinging back and forth, trying to catch any movement. And then I saw it, a shadow. A figure, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. My blood ran cold. It didn't move. It didn't do anything. It just stood there, still as a statue. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too human. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind was racing. What the hell was going on? I turned to run back into the cabin, but before I could reach the door, I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time, louder. Someone or something was coming. I bolted inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. My hands were shaking as I tried to calm my racing heart. I leaned against the door, listening. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. But I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't just wait for whoever it was to come inside. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there was no reception out here. I couldn't call for help. I was completely alone. I spent the next few hours huddled in the corner of the cabin, the fire slowly dying in the hearth. Every creak of the wood, every snap of a twig outside, made my heart leap in my chest. I couldn't tell if it was my imagination or if someone or something was still out there. By morning, the world outside was quiet again. The sun was just starting to rise, casting long shadows through the trees. I didn't know what to do. Should I stay and wait? Should I leave? I decided to leave. I packed up quickly, grabbing whatever I could and stuffing it into my car. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. As I drove away, the woods seemed to close in behind me. I didn't look back. I just kept driving all the way back to Asheville, not stopping until I was in a place that felt safe. I never went back to that cabin. I don't think I ever will. The fear, the unease, it stayed with me. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know one thing. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. I didn't feel at peace that night. I'm not sure I ever will, but I'm safe at least. That's the only thing that matters now. The air was cold when I stepped out of my truck, the fog still clinging to the ground like a thick, gray blanket. It was early October, and I was up in the Appalachian Mountains, far enough away from civilization to get some peace. I'd been dreaming of this getaway for months. A quiet weekend at a cabin I rented through a small, family-owned agency. They told me it was remote, tucked deep in the woods, the kind of place where you could truly disconnect. No Wi-Fi, no service, just trees, the sound of the wind, and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The cabin, when I first saw it, looked like something straight out of a postcard. Wooden, with a steep roof and a small porch that wrapped around to the side. Its stone chimney stuck out like a blackened thumb against the evergreen backdrop. There was something both comforting and eerie about it, especially in the low light of the early evening. I grabbed my bag, locked the truck, and made my way toward the door. The keys were in a small metal box next to the entrance, just like the instructions had said. After a quick search, I found them and let myself in. The inside was cozy but simple, just as I had hoped. A fireplace, a small kitchen, a few mismatched chairs around a wooden table, and a worn-out sofa. A staircase led up to a loft bedroom. I couldn't help but smile as I set my bag down by the door and made my way to the fireplace. I lit a fire right away, crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney. The warmth it gave off was immediate, filling the room in a few minutes. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first few hours were just how I imagined. I unpacked my things, set up my books on the coffee table, and sat down to read. The fire crackled in the background, a gentle, soothing sound. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees and making the shadows seem deeper. The silence between gusts of wind was like a muffled blanket, as if the world was holding its breath. I had planned on staying for the whole weekend, enjoying the isolation, maybe even doing a little hiking in the morning. But there was something about the place that felt a little off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer I stayed inside, the more aware I became of the creaks and groans of the cabin. I shook it off as nothing more than the house settling. But still, when I went to bed that night, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. I slept fitfully, waking up several times, hearing sounds that I couldn't explain. A thump, a scraping noise. But every time I checked the windows or the doors, there was nothing, just the dark wilderness outside. When morning came, I made myself breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. The light outside was soft, the fog still lingering in the trees. I had planned on hiking, but after a restless night, I wasn't feeling very eager to go far from the cabin. Instead, I decided to take a walk around the property. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. There was a trail that led up the hill behind the cabin, and I figured I could at least check that out. I grabbed my jacket and set out. The woods were thick and quiet. I walked for about an hour, admiring the towering pines and the soft carpet of pine needles underfoot. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and decay. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I'd hear something, twigs snapping, the rustle of leaves, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing. I brushed it off again as just my imagination. After all, I was alone in the woods. The trail eventually led to a small stream, its water trickling over rocks in a quiet rhythm. I sat down by the bank for a while, watching the water flow, listening to the soothing sounds of nature. But something wasn't right. There was a heaviness to the air that I couldn't explain. The wind had died down, and the silence felt oppressive, like everything was holding its breath. I decided to head back to the cabin. The walk back felt longer than the one out. The woods seemed darker, the trees closer together, their branches hanging low and thick. I kept hearing the same rustling, like something was moving just out of sight. But when I stopped and looked, there was nothing. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I felt a sense of relief. The front door creaked open as I pushed it. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until I was inside. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a moment, just listening. The wind had picked up again, howling outside, but inside it was quiet. I tried to shake the unease off. I made lunch, sat down at the table and read for a while, but the feeling of being watched persisted. It was as if there was something just beyond the walls, something that wasn't supposed to be there. By evening, I had convinced myself that I was being foolish. I went outside to gather some wood for the fire. The night was settling in, and the cabin was becoming colder. As I worked, I heard something. A twig snapped behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing. No animal, no movement. I took a deep breath and continued with my task. I was just imagining things. But then I heard it again. This time it was louder, closer. Something was definitely out there. I ran back to the cabin, my heart racing. I locked the door behind me and stood still, listening. There was no sound, just the wind. The fire in the cabin crackled, and I tried to calm my nerves. I sat down in front of it, my hands shaking as I grabbed a book and tried to read. But I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting to the noises I'd heard. As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I sat by the fire, staring at the flames, listening to the wind howl outside. The house creaked and groaned, and every now and then I heard a faint scratching sound, like something was dragging across the walls. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't closed my eyes all night, but when the light of dawn crept through the trees, I felt a sense of relief. I was alive. Nothing had happened. It was just my imagination. The place was old, and it made noises. That was all. I decided I'd leave. I packed my bags, grabbed my things, and was about to head out when I noticed something. The woodpile I had gathered the day before, half of it was gone. It wasn't just moved, it was missing. I froze. No one had been here with me. No one else had come by. I hadn't heard anyone approach, and the place was secluded. I walked to the edge of the property and looked around. There were no footprints in the dirt, no sign of anyone else. But there was something in the distance, just beyond the tree line. A figure, standing still, watching me. I felt my blood run cold. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, ran to the truck, and sped off without looking back. It had been a long year, and I needed a break. Work had drained me, and I was exhausted from the constant noise and stress of city life. So, I decided to take some time off and rent a cabin in the mountains. It seemed like the perfect way to disconnect from everything and reset. I found a small, remote cabin near a lake in northern Minnesota, away from all the hustle and bustle. The rental was basic, just the essentials, no internet, no cell service, no distractions. Perfect. I drove up alone, leaving behind my apartment, my phone, and my responsibilities. The drive was beautiful, long stretches of winding roads through thick forests, occasional glimpses of lakes and fields. It was late autumn, and the trees had already shed most of their leaves. The landscape was quiet, almost eerie, as I drove through the empty roads. There was something calming about the silence, though, and I found myself taking deep breaths as the fresh, crisp air filled my lungs. The cabin itself was nestled in a small clearing near the edge of a dense forest. It was made of wood, with a simple porch and a stone chimney. The owner had told me it was a basic, no-frills place, but that was fine by me. I was there for solitude, not luxury. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The inside was just as I expected, cozy but sparse. A small kitchen area, a living room with a fireplace, a few chairs, and a table. Upstairs, there was a single bedroom with a bed and a window that looked out over the forest. It was perfect. It was exactly what I needed. The first evening, I spent sitting by the fire, reading a book I had brought along. The air outside had turned cold, and the fire crackled and popped, sending warmth into the room. I didn't feel afraid, but there was a strange tension in the air. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just my mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The sound of the wind outside was unsettling, the trees groaning under its force. Occasionally, I would hear what sounded like something moving in the forest, but when I looked out the window, nothing was there. The first few days passed without incident. I spent my time hiking, cooking simple meals, and exploring the surrounding area. The forest was peaceful, but in a way that made the silence almost oppressive. There were no sounds of animals, no birds calling, no rustling in the underbrush. It was as if everything in the forest had gone still, waiting. I chalked it up to the changing seasons, but there was a part of me that felt something was off. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk along the lake. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the water. As I walked along the shore, I noticed a small path leading into the woods. It wasn't much, just a narrow trail barely wide enough for one person to walk through, but it piqued my curiosity. I hesitated for a moment, but then decided to follow it. The path wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and more densely packed as I walked. The air grew cooler, and the light dimmer as I ventured farther from the lake. After about half an hour of walking, I came across something strange, a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a large, flat stone, and around it were a few faded markings in the dirt, as if something had been moved or dragged recently. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked around, but saw nothing that would explain the feeling of unease that was creeping over me. I turned to leave, but as I did, I noticed something in the distance, a structure barely visible through the trees. At first, I thought it might be another cabin, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a small, dilapidated shed, half hidden behind overgrown vines and thick brush. The door was hanging ajar, and I could see inside. There was nothing but dark shadows. I hesitated, considering turning back, but something inside me urged me forward. I approached the door and peered inside, but before I could get a good look, a sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut. I jumped back, heart racing, and quickly turned around. The forest around me seemed to close in, the trees now towering high above, casting long shadows. I felt a deep, unsettling sensation creeping up my spine. I had to get out of there. I turned back toward the trail, but as I did, I thought I heard something moving behind me. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, following my every step. I didn't stop. I ran. The path seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in, the underbrush grabbing at my legs. My breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare look back. I pushed forward, heart pounding in my chest, feeling the weight of something unseen and dangerous pressing in on me. After what felt like an eternity, I finally burst out of the trees and back into the clearing where the cabin was visible in the distance. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, feeling the tension drain from my body. My hands were shaking, my heart racing. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the wind outside, the trees rustling and groaning. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched lingered, as if something was waiting just outside the door. I spent the rest of the evening inside, not daring to go back outside. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, watching me. The forest had never felt so alive, so full of unseen eyes. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to find. The following day, I packed my things and decided to leave. I had no desire to spend another night in that cabin. The hike back to my car felt like a long journey, the path through the woods stretching out before me. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me. But when I finally reached my car, I felt a sense of relief. I was leaving that place behind, and with it, whatever strange feeling had clung to me. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the cabin one last time. It sat there in the distance, still and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The forest around it seemed peaceful again, but I knew better. Whatever I had felt that day, the eyes watching me, the strange markings, the abandoned shed, would stay with me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I didn't need to find out. The forest had its secrets, and I had learned enough. I had no intention of returning. The night started off peaceful enough. I had rented a small cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, just a few hours from my apartment in Knoxville, Tennessee. The cabin was an older, rustic building, nestled deep in the woods. The road leading up to it was rough, barely a proper trail, and at times I felt like I might be driving in circles. It was exactly what I wanted, a getaway from the hustle of the city and the constant noise of modern life. I'd been planning this trip for months, needing some time to think. I wasn't sure what I was thinking about, but I felt like I needed the solitude. So when I finally reached the cabin, I was ready to spend the next few days alone. The cabin itself was simple: 2 rooms, a living area with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a modest bedroom. The wood floors creaked underfoot, and there was the unmistakable smell of aged pine. I liked it, felt comfortable. There was an old rocking chair in the corner by the window, and I couldn't help but sit in it for a while. The view outside was stunning: thick trees as far as I could see, and the mountain range in the distance. I settled in, unpacked my things, and made a fire. Felt good to finally relax after the drive. I was about to take out a book when I heard something. It was faint, barely audible, like something scraping along the ground outside. I froze. It wasn't the wind. The sound was too distinct, like claws dragging through dirt. I stood up slowly and moved to the window. The forest outside was dim with the fading light of the evening. Nothing. The trees barely rustled. I dismissed it as an animal, maybe a bear or raccoon. I had read there were plenty of them around here. Settling back down, I convinced myself to relax. The night rolled on peacefully, and I went to bed around midnight. The bed was comfortable, though the sheets felt a little rough. The first night passed without incident, and I woke the next morning feeling refreshed. I spent the day hiking the nearby trails, enjoying the silence, the peace. I was starting to feel like this was just what I needed. But then, as the sun began to set on the second day, something happened that would change everything. I had returned to the cabin, sweaty and tired from the hike, and as I opened the door, I saw a set of fresh footprints in the dirt just outside the threshold. I stopped dead. The tracks weren't from a bear, that much was clear. They were human-sized, but they didn't look like they were made by someone who had been walking normally. They were strange, deep, almost as if whoever had made them had been dragging something heavy behind them. My heart skipped a beat. I stepped inside and locked the door, my mind racing. I hadn't seen anyone on the trail earlier. Hell, I hadn't seen anyone all day, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. Who could be out here? I didn't want to think too much about it, but I couldn't help myself. I stayed close to the windows, watching the edge of the forest, expecting something to move out there. After an hour or so, I convinced myself it was just my imagination getting the best of me. I was tired. I needed rest. The second night passed without event, but I didn't sleep well. Every little sound made me jump. The wind, the branches scraping the roof, the occasional animal call. It all felt unnerving now. Something was off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. By the third day, I was feeling paranoid. I ventured out to investigate the footprints more thoroughly, but they were already fading. The rain from the night before had washed them away. It didn't matter. What stuck with me wasn't the footprints, it was the feeling that I wasn't alone here. As the day wore on, the feeling grew stronger. It was almost as if someone was watching me. Couldn't shake it. I tried to push it out of my mind. After all, I was out here to escape my own thoughts, not to let them consume me. That night, just as I was about to get some rest, I heard a loud bang from outside. Something heavy had struck the door. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the window, peering out. Nothing, but I could feel it. Someone was out there. I quickly bolted the door and turned off the light, trying to be as quiet as possible. I sat in the dark for what felt like hours, my eyes straining to see anything moving. There was nothing, only the sounds of the night, the wind, the rustling leaves, the occasional distant howl of some animal. The next day, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to know if someone had been near my cabin. The more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. I walked around the cabin, looking for any signs of disturbance. It wasn't much, but there was a scratch on the doorframe, just below the lock, as if someone had tried to force it open. I cursed under my breath and rushed back inside. My first instinct was to leave, to grab my stuff and just drive back to the city. But something kept me rooted to the cabin. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the thought that whoever or whatever was out there might be gone by morning. I tried to convince myself to stay, to ride it out. But as night fell, my fear only grew. Couldn't sleep at all that night. I lay in bed, listening to every sound, every creak of the cabin. I was sure that if I closed my eyes for even a second, someone would be right there. Every scratch of a branch against the cabin wall made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside again. It was closer than before. I grabbed the flashlight, my heart racing. I slowly crept to the window and peered out. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew someone was there. My blood ran cold. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys, shoved them into my pocket, and rushed out the back door. The figure had disappeared by the time I got outside, but I didn't care. I ran through the woods, not stopping until I was far enough away from the cabin that I felt safe, though I knew deep down there was no true safety. I spent the night in the woods, terrified of what I might find if I returned to the cabin. The next morning, I decided to leave the cabin behind. I packed up my stuff, drove back down the rough trail, and didn't stop until I was miles away from that place. I haven't gone back since. I don't even like to think about it. But the strangest thing happened when I was home. I was unpacking my gear, still shaken, when I found something in one of my bags, a small piece of cloth. It was torn and I had no idea where it came from. But I knew it was from my cabin. Somehow, whatever had happened out there followed me home. That's the last thing I'll say about it. I don't know who or what it was, and I don't want to know. I'm just glad to be home, safe and sound. It's late October, a little over a week since I turned 28. I'd been working nonstop, just grinding at my job, trying to get everything together. So when I finally had a few days off, I decided to get away. I needed to clear my head. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, but this time I was heading further into the mountains, a place I had heard about from a few friends. A small cabin out in the middle of nowhere, isolated, where there was nothing but peace and quiet. No distractions, no work emails, just me and the woods. The cabin was located up near the Blue Ridge Mountains, tucked away in the woods, an hour and a half from the nearest town. The road to get there wasn't paved, just a bumpy, dusty trail that seemed to stretch forever through thick trees. I had to drive my old Jeep up there. The last thing I wanted was to deal with getting stuck in the mud with no cell service. But that was part of the charm, being off the grid. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm orange glow over the hills. The place was everything I imagined it would be. Simple, small, with a wide front porch that overlooked the valley below. The wood was weathered, and the paint on the trim was peeling in spots. It had a rustic, lived-in feel, the kind of place you'd expect someone to retreat to for some peace of mind. I got out of the Jeep and stretched my legs, breathing in the fresh mountain air. Felt like a relief to be out here. The air was cool, crisp, almost sharp, and it smelled like pine. I grabbed my bag and went inside. The interior was exactly what I needed. A simple living room with a fireplace, a couple of worn-out chairs, a kitchen with all the basics, and a loft upstairs where the bedroom was. There was no Wi-Fi, no phone service, nothing. Just what I needed to disconnect. I set down my bag and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the world slide off my shoulders. The first night was peaceful. I made a quick dinner, roasted some marshmallows over the fire, and read a book. The sound of the wind outside was constant, rustling the leaves in the trees. There were no other sounds. No traffic, no people. Just the wind and the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. It felt strange at first, being this alone, but I quickly got used to it. By the time I went to bed, it was dark, really dark. I had gotten so used to the artificial light of the city that I forgot how complete the darkness could be in the mountains. No streetlights, no lights from other houses. Just the pitch-black night and the soft glow of the moon filtering through the trees. The next day, I woke up early. I was already enjoying the quiet of the place. No cars driving by, no alarms ringing. Just the sun rising slowly over the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I spent most of the day hiking the trails around the cabin. There were some great views of the valley below, the leaves turning all shades of red, orange, and yellow. The forest was thick, the kind of place that felt like it went on forever. I didn't run into anyone all day. I didn't expect to. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car on the road since I left the main highway. It was the kind of isolation that felt peaceful at first, but eventually started to feel a little unnerving. Not that I was scared, just aware of how alone I was. By the time evening rolled around, I was back at the cabin, cooking a small dinner and relaxing by the fire. The wind outside had picked up, howling through the trees, making the cabin creak and groan. The fire crackled, and I was just about to settle into a chair with a drink when I heard something. At first, it was barely audible, like a soft thud. I froze, straining my ears. Came again, a little louder this time. It was coming from outside. A heavy, rhythmic thumping sound. I tried to convince myself it was just a branch hitting the side of the cabin or maybe an animal moving through the woods. But it didn't stop. It went on for a while, almost like something or someone was walking around the outside of the cabin. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I tried to remain calm. I wasn't stupid. I knew there were animals out here. Bears, raccoons, maybe even deer. But why didn't I hear them earlier? Why was it so persistent? I got up and walked over to the window, peering through the blinds. All I could see was the darkness of the woods, the trees swaying in the wind. Nothing. But the noise kept coming, slow and steady, like footsteps. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't about to go outside in the middle of the night, especially with no way to defend myself. I checked the door, making sure it was locked, and then grabbed a flashlight, just in case. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving me with a sick feeling in my stomach. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a bear moving through the trees. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that was starting to creep in. I went to bed shortly after, but I didn't sleep well. The wind howled outside, and I kept thinking I heard something moving in the trees. At one point, I even heard something tapping on the window, but when I got up to check, there was nothing there, just the darkness of the forest. The next day, I decided to stay inside. I wasn't sure if I was just being paranoid, but something didn't feel right. I spent the day reading, trying to distract myself. The weather had turned colder, and the wind had picked up even more. The trees outside were swaying, their branches creaking and groaning in the wind. That night, things took a turn for the worse. Around midnight, I was woken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps again. But this time, it wasn't just the wind. It was closer, much closer. It was as if someone was standing right outside the door. I grabbed the flashlight again, my heart racing. The footsteps didn't stop. They were slow, deliberate, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there. I checked the door again, making sure it was still locked. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone from the nearby town? Had they come to rob me or something? I didn't think so. I had been careful to tell no one where I was going. I sat in the dark for a long time, too scared to move, the sound of the footsteps echoing in my head. After what felt like hours, I finally gathered the courage to get up and look outside. I opened the front door slowly, flashlight in hand, but the porch was empty. The wind howled through the trees, and the darkness was almost suffocating. I stood there for a moment, just staring into the blackness, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer had wandered too close to the cabin, or maybe I had just been imagining things. But then I saw something. Movement. A figure just at the edge of the trees. I couldn't make out who or what it was, but it was definitely there, standing still, watching. My heart pounded in my chest. The figure didn't move. It was just standing there, almost like it was waiting for something. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. I had no phone, no way to call for help. I couldn't just stand there all night. Something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. I quickly stepped back inside and slammed the door shut. The footsteps outside stopped, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I locked every door and window and then went upstairs to the loft, where the bedroom was. I couldn't sleep, not after what I'd seen. The wind had picked up even more, and every now and then, I thought I could hear something brushing against the cabin's walls. I stayed awake all night, lying in bed, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd seen. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I had overreacted. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care if I never came back to that cabin again. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. As I drove back down the long, bumpy road, I glanced in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. But there was nothing. I didn't return to that cabin. A week later, I learned from the neighbors in the nearest town that there had been reports of strange activity in the area. People had heard footsteps and seen figures in the trees, too, but no one knew who or what it was. I don't know what happened out there, but I do know that I'll never go back to that cabin. Whatever it was that I saw, whatever it was that I heard, it wasn't natural. It wasn't just a bear or a deer. Something was out there, and I'm lucky I got away. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, far from civilization. I had driven for hours, the paved roads eventually giving way to dirt and gravel paths that seemed to get more narrow with every mile. The sun was setting by the time I finally arrived, casting a dim, golden light that filtered through the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the scent sharp and fresh. I was 29 years old, an introverted type, not one for crowds or the busy city life. I liked peace, solitude, the kind that came with a place like this. This cabin had been passed down to me by an uncle I barely knew. He was a quiet man, a loner like me, who had kept to himself and spent his weekends here in the woods. When he passed away a few months ago, the cabin came into my possession. At first, I'd considered selling it. What did I need with a cabin so far out? But something about it tugged at me, a curiosity I couldn't ignore. So, I decided to spend a few days here, clear my mind, maybe even find some peace. The moment I pulled up to the cabin, I felt a strange unease. It wasn't the kind of fear you get from horror movies, nothing like that. It was more a quiet discomfort, like a knot in my stomach I couldn't untangle. The cabin was old, weathered with peeling paint and sagging window frames. It wasn't anything to write home about, but it had a certain charm. Still, there was something unsettling about it. I shook off the feeling, grabbed my bags and made my way inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Dust swirled in the air, catching the dim light. The interior was simple with just the basics. A couch, a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a fireplace. A thick layer of dust covered everything, as if no one had been here for years. I dropped my bags by the door and made my way to the small kitchen to start a fire. It was chilly in the cabin, and the thought of a warm fire was comforting. I spent the next few hours getting the place set up, sweeping the floors, lighting the stove, and making the bed. As night fell, I found myself sitting in front of the fire, the crackling of the wood the only sound in the cabin. The silence was deep and complete. There was no wind outside, no animals calling, just the stillness of the forest, stretching on forever. I had brought some food with me, but after a long drive, I was too tired to cook anything. Instead, I pulled out a sandwich and ate in front of the fire, my eyes flicking from the flames to the shadows creeping across the cabin. Something about the place didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the isolation or the unfamiliarity of it all. The longer I sat there, the more aware I became of how alone I really was. The fire eventually burned down, leaving behind glowing embers. I couldn't bring myself to go to bed yet, not with the strange feeling gnawing at me. I decided to step outside for a bit. The night air was cool, crisp, and it felt refreshing against my skin. The moon was full, casting long shadows across the clearing in front of the cabin. I looked around, but all I could see were trees. The woods seemed to stretch on forever, dark and endless. I walked a little ways from the cabin, just to stretch my legs. The path was narrow, overgrown with weeds and brambles, but I didn't mind. I had no intention of going far, just a quick look around before heading back to the warmth of the cabin. That's when I heard it, a rustling sound coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't the wind, I could tell that much. The trees were still, the air thick with silence. The sound was too deliberate, too close. My heart skipped a beat. I froze, straining my ears, but there was nothing else. Just that rustle, like something or someone moving through the underbrush. I took a deep breath and tried to shake off the unease. It was probably just an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the longer I stood there, the more the sound seemed to grow, closer now, like it was following me. I turned quickly and walked back toward the cabin, my steps quickening. The feeling of being watched hit me then, a cold prickle down my spine. I couldn't shake it, no matter how much I told myself I was being ridiculous. As I reached the cabin, I felt a rush of relief, stepping inside and locking the door behind me. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. I kept the lights low and the curtains drawn, not daring to look outside again. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch, but sleep didn't come easily. I was restless, jerking awake every few hours, my mind playing tricks on me. I kept thinking I heard something outside, something moving just beyond the edge of the trees. But every time I mustered the courage to peek outside, there was nothing, just the woods, quiet and still. The next morning, I woke up early, the sun filtering in through the windows, casting a soft glow on the cabin's wooden interior. It was a new day, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined everything. But that nagging feeling lingered, like a shadow I couldn't escape. I decided to head into town to grab some supplies, hoping the drive would clear my head. The small town was about 30 minutes away, and the drive was peaceful with wide open spaces and rolling hills. I bought some food, checked out the local diner, and even spoke to a few people. Everything felt normal, but as I made my way back to the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I returned, the first thing I noticed was that the door was slightly ajar. I knew I had locked it before I left. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached cautiously, the silence stretching out before me like a thick fog. I didn't hear anything, but I was certain I wasn't alone. I pushed the door open slowly, my hand on the handle, my breath shallow. The cabin was dark, colder than before. My eyes flicked from one corner to the next, searching for anything out of place. But there was nothing, no signs of forced entry, no broken windows. It was just still, too still. I stepped inside, my gaze sweeping over the room. Then I froze. Something was different. The air felt thicker, heavier, like something had changed in my absence. I moved cautiously toward the living room, where I had left my bags. They were still there, but the floor, it was covered in small twigs and leaves, like someone had been walking through the cabin while I was gone. My heart raced. I hadn't noticed them before, but they were there now, scattered across the wooden floor. Panic set in. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Could someone have broken in? I didn't want to think about it, but the possibility seemed more real with every second. I grabbed a heavy candle holder from the table, holding it like a weapon, and slowly began to check the rooms. The bedroom was untouched, but the bathroom door was slightly open. I pushed it open, every muscle in my body tense, ready for whatever I might find. It was empty, but then I saw something on the floor, a small, twisted piece of fabric. It was too familiar. I knelt down and picked it up. It was from one of my shirts, one I'd left on the bed this morning. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. Someone had been here. Someone had been inside the cabin, in my space, going through my things. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than before. My skin prickled with the knowledge that I wasn't alone anymore. I spent the next few hours trying to calm myself, telling myself that it could have been an animal or maybe just a freak coincidence. But deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't safe here. Something was wrong. The forest wasn't just a place of beauty and serenity. It was hiding something I couldn't see, but could feel. That night, I locked every door and window and sat by the fire, listening to the sounds outside. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every crack, every snap of a twig sent me into a frenzy, my heart pounding in my chest. I spent the night waiting for something, anything, to happen. By the time morning came, I was exhausted, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed up my things, ready to leave, ready to escape. As I stepped out of the cabin and into the sunlight, I felt the weight on my chest lift, even if just a little. The woods were quiet again, but something told me that whatever had been watching me was still out there, lurking in the trees. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror at the cabin one last time. The sun was high now, casting a golden light across the trees. The place didn't seem as foreboding in the daylight, but I knew I would never return. Some things were better left unexplored. The first thing I remember about that weekend was how much I needed a break. My name's Ethan. I'm 29, a software developer living in a small town in Vermont. I had been working long hours, barely getting enough sleep, and I was starting to feel it. When I found an old cabin listed on a rental site, secluded deep in the woods, it seemed perfect for getting away from the stress of city life. I booked it for a long weekend, hoping the quiet would reset my mind. I packed my car early Friday morning, leaving the small town I'd lived in my entire life. The drive out to the cabin took me through winding, narrow roads. The area was sparsely populated, and it wasn't long before the road turned into a gravel path that barely fit my car. The trees seemed to close in around me, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The place looked exactly like it did in the pictures. A rustic, two-story structure made of weathered wood, with a stone chimney and a small porch. The cabin was nestled on the edge of a forest with a small stream running nearby, the kind of place you'd think was perfect for hiking, reading, and complete solitude. I grabbed my bags from the car, the air already starting to cool as the sun began to dip behind the trees. The cabin's porch creaked underfoot as I stepped up to the front door. It was a bit of a relief to see the door wasn't locked. I hadn't received any instructions on how to get the key. I pushed the door open, stepping into the dim interior. The smell hit me first. It wasn't unpleasant, just that old, musty scent of a place that hadn't been used in a while. Dust motes swirled in the beams of sunlight coming through the small windows, and the floors creaked as I walked through the small entryway into the main room. There was a stone fireplace along one wall, and a couple of couches that looked as though they'd been there for decades. The whole place had a homely feel, though it was clear it needed some work. Still, it was cozy enough for me to feel comfortable. I unpacked my things quickly, setting up my laptop on the small wooden table in the corner, though I didn't expect to be doing much work while I was there. I planned to go for a walk after dinner, explore the area. The cabin was supposed to be in the middle of nowhere, but I'd heard of a nearby trail that led to an old mill. It wasn't much of a hike, just a few miles, but I figured it would be a good way to stretch my legs after the long drive. Dinner was simple: pasta, canned vegetables, and some bread I picked up at the market. It wasn't gourmet, but it worked. Afterward, I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. The evening air was cool but fresh, with the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest around the cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. Not a single animal sound. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the isolation. The trail was marked by small wooden signs, though I had to be careful to follow them as the path twisted through thick trees and underbrush. It wasn't difficult, but there were places where the ground was uneven, and I had to watch my step. I walked for about 45 minutes, keeping an eye on the fading light. By the time I reached the old mill, I was starting to feel that the silence was getting a little unsettling. There was no wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. The mill, when I finally reached it, was just as I imagined. A decaying stone building with half a roof, standing next to a dry, overgrown creek. The place looked like it hadn't been used in years, maybe even decades. I explored the area briefly, but didn't find anything particularly interesting. There were no signs of life, no animals, no recent human presence. Felt empty, like the whole world had forgotten about this place. I stayed for maybe 10 more minutes, then decided to head back. As I walked through the woods, the silence grew heavier. I began to feel uneasy, like I was being watched. It wasn't a thought that I could shake. My skin tingled, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. But something about it felt wrong. I picked up the pace, finally reaching the cabin in what felt like a hurry. That night, I locked the doors, pulled the curtains shut, and settled into bed. The mattress wasn't the most comfortable, but it was better than sleeping in the car. Still, sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing noises outside, faint creaks and scratches. It wasn't the wind, it was something else. Maybe an animal, I told myself, or perhaps the house settling. I tried to ignore it, but every time I started to drift off, the sound would pull me back to full awareness. I finally fell asleep around 2 in the morning, but it was a restless sleep. The next day was more of the same. I woke up early, made breakfast, and then headed out for another hike. This time, I was more careful, staying closer to the trail and keeping a sharp eye out for any signs of wildlife. The silence from the day before had returned, but now it felt even more oppressive. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it kept coming back. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was starting to set again. I felt exhausted physically, mentally. The quiet was starting to get to me. I could have sworn I'd seen something move out of the corner of my eye while walking through the trees. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just more trees. I spent the evening inside, cooking a quiet meal. I didn't want to go back out into the woods. I wasn't sure why, but I had this nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The house, the land, it all felt off. The unsettling feeling grew worse after dinner. It wasn't just the sounds or the silence or the way the air felt so thick. It was the feeling of being completely alone, surrounded by something I couldn't understand. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up, sitting on the couch, staring at the flickering flames in the fireplace. The house creaked in the darkness, and every little sound seemed amplified. Every time the wind picked up, I thought I heard footsteps, faint but distinct, as if someone else was walking just outside. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but at some point, I heard something that made my heart stop, a tapping, soft and irregular, at the door. I froze, holding my breath. It came again, this time louder, more deliberate. Whoever or whatever was out there, they weren't trying to hide. They wanted me to hear it. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking. My mind raced with thoughts. A lost hiker, Maybe someone from the nearby town who didn't realize I was staying there. I grabbed the flashlight and approached the door, my hand trembling on the doorknob. The tap came again, just as I was about to open it. And then, without warning, it stopped. The silence was unbearable. I waited for what felt like an eternity before I finally opened the door. Nothing. There was no one there. I stood in the doorway for a few moments, scanning the area with the flashlight. There was no sign of anyone. The forest was quiet, the air still. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it for a moment, trying to steady my breath. I knew I wasn't imagining things. Someone or something had been out there. That was the moment I decided I was done. I didn't care what the rental agreement said. I was leaving. I packed my bags quickly, grabbing what I could and tossing it into the car. The air had grown cold, and the forest around me seemed more menacing than ever. As I drove down the gravel path, the trees pressing in on me from both sides, I glanced back at the cabin in my rearview mirror. It stood there, silent and empty, just as it had when I arrived. But now it felt different. Felt like it was waiting for me to come back. When I finally reached the main road, the weight that had been pressing on my chest lifted. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I called to cancel the rest of my stay. They seemed surprised, but they didn't argue. I don't know if anyone else had rented that cabin since. I never checked. It's been years now, but I still think about it sometimes. The feeling of being watched, the strange noises, the way the world around me seemed to shift. It wasn't anything supernatural, no ghosts or fairy tales. It was just off, something I couldn't explain. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe there was something wrong with that place, something buried in the woods. I don't know, but I know I'll never go back to that cabin again, and I never will. The sun had just started dipping behind the mountain peaks as I drove up the long, winding road leading to the cabin. I had been planning this solo trip for months. Just me, the quiet of nature, and a few days to disconnect from everything. The cabin, tucked away in the dense woods of Montana, seemed like the perfect spot to escape. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but it had everything I needed. A wood-burning stove, a few mismatched pieces of furniture, and a small loft. It was as simple as it gets, and that was exactly what I wanted. I pulled my truck to a stop in front of the small cabin, dust kicking up behind me. The air was cold, and the scent of pine trees mixed with the crisp mountain breeze. I grabbed my bags from the back and made my way to the door, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The porch creaked as I stepped onto it, and I felt that familiar sense of excitement, the kind that comes with being somewhere isolated, far from the noise of the world. The inside of the cabin was cozy. The faded wooden floors groaned under my feet, and the fire pit in the middle of the room had a few logs stacked beside it. The walls were lined with old photographs, mostly of previous owners, and the furniture was a mix of worn but comfortable pieces. I set my bags down and opened the small window by the sink, letting in the fresh, cool air. I spent the next few hours settling in. The cabin had no electricity, just a few oil lamps that provided soft, flickering light. As the night grew darker, I lit a few of them and made myself some dinner. Nothing fancy, just canned soup and some bread. The fire crackled softly in the stove, and I felt at peace. The silence was unlike anything I had experienced in the city. It wasn't unsettling at all. It felt like I had found a little corner of the world all to myself. Later, I stepped outside to get some fresh air. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like pinpricks of light. The moon was full, casting a pale glow on the surrounding trees. The air was still, and the only sounds were the distant rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a night bird. I stood on the porch for a while, just breathing in the cool, crisp air, before heading back inside to get some sleep. That night, I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. No footsteps on the porch, no strange noises in the woods, just the soft crackle of the fire and the occasional wind gust. I drifted off to sleep with no trouble. The next morning, I woke up to a quiet, overcast sky. The The clouds hung low in the sky, heavy with the threat of rain. I had planned on hiking to a nearby lake, but with the weather looking uncertain, I decided to stick closer to the cabin. I spent the day reading and enjoying the peace and quiet. I even chopped some wood for the fire and explored the small clearing around the cabin. Everything felt perfect, just the kind of escape I had been hoping for. That evening, as the sky darkened again, the first raindrops began to fall. I made myself another simple meal, and as I ate, I noticed something strange. From my seat by the window, I saw a figure moving in the distance. It was hard to make out, but it looked like someone walking along the edge of the tree line. The figure moved slowly, almost as if it didn't want to be seen. I stood up, squinting to get a better look, but by the time I reached the door, the figure was gone. I told myself it was probably just someone hiking in the area. There were a few other cabins nearby, and I wasn't entirely isolated. Still, the sight left me feeling uneasy. I spent the next few hours trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. The wind had picked up, and the rain began to fall harder, pelting the roof of the cabin with a steady rhythm. The sound was soothing, and I curled up with a book to distract myself. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise that made my blood run cold. It was faint at first, just a soft rustling sound coming from outside. I assumed it was the wind, but then it came again, closer this time, almost like someone was moving around the cabin. My heart began to race, and I held my breath, straining to listen. The wind howled outside, and the rain beat against the walls, but beneath it, I could hear something moving around, shuffling footsteps, like someone was circling the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight beside my bed, my hands trembling as I turned it on and pointed it toward the door. My mind raced, and I told myself that I was being paranoid, that it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then I heard the distinct sound of something heavy bumping against the porch, followed by a scraping noise, like something was being dragged across the wood. My heart pounded in my chest, and I froze, unsure of what to do. I had no phone service out here, no way of contacting anyone. If something went wrong, I was completely alone. The sound of scraping continued, growing louder and more frantic. It was coming from the back of the cabin now, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. My mind raced through all the worst-case scenarios. Someone was out there, someone who shouldn't be. But I told myself again to calm down. This was just a random person, maybe someone who had lost their way in the storm. I had read about people getting caught in weather like this and seeking shelter in cabins, so it made sense, right? I waited for what felt like hours, listening intently. The noises stopped suddenly, and a tense silence filled the air. For a long time, I didn't move, unsure of whether to get up and check or stay hidden. Eventually, I couldn't stand it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight again, my hands shaking as I crept toward the door. I took a deep breath and pushed it open, stepping out onto the porch. The rain had slowed to a light drizzle, and the air was thick with fog. The beam from my flashlight cut through the mist, illuminating the empty yard. I scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. I slowly walked around the cabin, the beam of light bouncing off the wet trees, but everything seemed still. I felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived. That's when I noticed something strange. Near the back corner of the cabin, half hidden in the shadows, was a small pile of rocks. It was odd. There had been nothing there earlier, and I certainly hadn't put them there. My mind raced again, and I moved closer to get a better look. The rocks were arranged in a way that looked deliberate, as if someone had taken the time to stack them. But who would do that out here? I stood there for a few minutes, staring at the rocks, when I heard it again, the soft rustling sound. This time, it was definitely not the wind. It came from the woods behind me, and it was moving fast, getting closer. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the sound, shining the flashlight in that direction. The beam of light flicked over the trees, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me. My hands were slick with sweat, and my pulse was racing. I could feel my mind spiraling, convincing me that something was wrong, that I wasn't alone. I grabbed my bags and started thinking about how I could leave, but the roads were likely washed out, and the storm had only gotten worse. There was no way I could drive out of here safely in these conditions. I spent the rest of the night lying wide awake in bed, every creak of the cabin making me jump. The rain kept falling, and the wind howled outside, but it wasn't the storm that kept me up. It was the feeling that I was being watched, the constant sense that someone was out there, just beyond the trees. I didn't dare look outside again. The next morning, the storm had passed, and the world outside was eerily quiet. The sun had broken through the clouds, and the air smelled fresh and clean. I decided to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, and the strange events of the previous night had left me too rattled to stay any longer. I packed up my things quickly, barely taking the time to gather my thoughts. As I drove away from the cabin, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, isolated in the misty woods, looking completely normal. But I couldn't forget the feeling I had, the feeling that something had been watching me the whole time. When I finally reached town, I stopped at the small gas station to refuel. The old man behind the counter gave me a look as I paid for the gas. "You staying out at that cabin?" he asked, his voice gruff. I nodded, still feeling on edge. He shook his head, a knowing look in his eyes. "You're lucky you left when you did. Folks around here say that cabin's cursed. People used to disappear up there. Some say they just walked off, but others..." He let the sentence trail off, his eyes locking with mine. I didn't need to hear the rest. I paid and left quickly, my hands still trembling from the night's events. The decision to get away for the weekend had been a long time coming. I needed a break. The past few months had been stressful at work, and with everything happening in my life, I thought a weekend in a remote cabin would be the perfect escape. I didn't want to deal with people, distractions, or the usual noise of the city. Just peace and quiet. At least that's what I thought. I booked the cabin in a small, secluded area in the mountains of northern Montana. The place was advertised as cozy and isolated, with only a handful of neighbors scattered a few miles away. The owner had promised a fully equipped cabin with a wood stove, a stocked kitchen, and plenty of hiking trails nearby. It seemed perfect. The drive up was beautiful, especially as I left the highways behind and the winding mountain roads began to twist and turn. I passed a few old barns, fields of tall grass swaying in the wind, and the occasional herd of cattle. It felt like I was stepping back in time, and the further I drove, the quieter it got. There was a peacefulness to the landscape that I hadn't realized I'd been craving. I finally reached the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks. The place looked just like the pictures. A simple log cabin with a small porch and a woodpile stacked neatly beside the door. There was no one else in sight, no sign of life other than the rustling of the trees and the chirping of birds. I took a deep breath, enjoying the fresh air. I had no intention of doing much beyond relaxing, maybe hiking if I felt like it, and spending the evenings reading or cooking. I unpacked my bags and settled in. The cabin was indeed cozy, just as the owner had described. The kitchen was small but functional, and the living room had a stone fireplace with a comfortable couch. There was a small bathroom and one bedroom with a large bed, thick blankets, and windows that opened to the woods beyond. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the city life I had left behind. After getting everything in place, I made myself a simple dinner and sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. I couldn't remember the last time I had felt this relaxed, so far removed from the daily grind. As the sun disappeared, the sky turned a deep, rich purple, and the stars began to emerge, more vivid than I had ever seen them in the city. That night, I went to bed early, ready for a good night's sleep. The bed was comfortable, and the quiet of the wilderness outside felt soothing. I closed my eyes, listening to the soft rustle of the trees, the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. But it was all peaceful, and I soon drifted off. It was the sound that woke me up, a strange noise in the night. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull me from sleep. At first, I thought it was an animal outside, maybe a raccoon or a deer, moving around near the cabin. But then I heard it again, closer this time. A tapping, like something was lightly knocking on the cabin walls. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. My heart started to beat faster, but I tried to calm myself. It was probably just an animal, maybe even the wind, pushing something against the cabin. I had to remind myself that I was out in the wilderness, far from the safety of the city, and these things happened. I lay back down, but the tapping didn't stop. It continued intermittently, as if whatever it was circling the cabin. I couldn't tell what direction it was coming from. I got up and went to the window, carefully peeking through the curtains. There was no movement outside, nothing that could explain the sound. The moonlight cast a silver glow over the landscape, but the woods were quiet, too quiet. I went to check the doors, making sure they were all locked. I could feel my nerves start to fray, but I didn't want to be paranoid. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was a tree branch rubbing against the cabin, or an animal scratching at the wood. I told myself that I'd be fine, and I went back to bed, still hearing the occasional tap. But soon it stopped. The silence felt unnerving in a way that I couldn't quite explain. I tried to sleep again, but every little creak and crack seemed amplified in the stillness. The next morning, the sunlight was bright and warm, and the air was fresh, like it had rained during the night. I felt better after a cup of coffee, deciding to shake off the previous night's unease. I grabbed my backpack and headed out for a hike, hoping the physical activity would clear my head. The trail started just behind the cabin, winding through thick forest. The trees towered overhead, and the ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. It was peaceful, and as I walked, I lost myself in the quiet of the woods. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. The tapping from last night seemed like a distant memory. After about an hour, I reached a clearing with a small stream running through it. The water was crystal clear, and I paused to take in the beauty. I knelt by the edge of the stream, cupping my hands to drink from it. The water was cool and refreshing. It felt good to be this far from civilization, surrounded by nothing but nature. I sat down on a large rock, enjoying the serenity. That's when I noticed it. The footprint. It was fresh, the dirt still disturbed, leading toward the edge of the clearing. My first thought was that it was a bear or a large animal, but it didn't look like any animal print I knew. It was oddly shaped, too small for a bear, too deep to be from a deer. I couldn't figure out what it was, but the longer I stared at it, the more I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. I stood up and looked around, but there was no sign of anything else. The woods were still, the air thick with the smell of earth and pine. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a hiker who had passed through earlier, though the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the footprint was leading away from the trail. That wasn't right. No one else was supposed to be out here. I didn't stay much longer. My nerves were starting to get the better of me, and I decided to head back to the cabin. The feeling of being watched hadn't left me, and the thought of going back to the cabin was a bit of a relief. As I walked back through the woods, I kept my eyes on the path, not wanting to look around too much. Something about the silence felt wrong. Every snap of a twig made me jump. Every rustle of leaves sounded like it was something bigger. When I returned to the cabin, I locked the door behind me. I didn't know why, but I felt safer with it shut tight. I tried to push the feeling aside, but it lingered. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to relax, but every sound outside sent my heart racing. The tapping had started again, light at first, but gradually becoming more distinct. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't the wind. It was deliberate, too methodical. I tried to tell myself that I was overthinking it, that it was nothing more than the cabin settling, or perhaps some other noise from the forest. That night, I couldn't sleep. The tapping was constant, relentless, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and went outside. The cold air hit me, and I immediately regretted my decision. But I needed to know. I needed to figure out what was going on. I walked around the cabin, scanning the darkness with the beam of my flashlight. I circled the entire cabin, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was no one there. No sign of movement, nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees. But the tapping, it was still there, faintly, from somewhere in the woods. I followed the sound, walking deeper into the trees. The further I went, the louder it became. My breath came in shallow gasps as I pushed through the underbrush, the flashlight trembling in my hands. The tapping grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from a large, old tree up ahead. As I got closer, I froze. The tapping wasn't random anymore. It was rhythmic, like someone knocking, and it was coming from the tree itself. I stepped forward, my breath caught in my throat. Then I saw it. A man crouched behind the tree. He was wearing old, tattered clothes, and his hands were pressed against the trunk, knocking on it. He was staring at the ground, completely unaware of me. I didn't know what to do. Panic surged through me, but I managed to stay still. My heart raced, my mind spinning. How long had he been out here? Was he dangerous? I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. I turned and ran back to the cabin, my legs shaking. I locked the door behind me and bolted all the windows. That night, I barely slept, my eyes darting to every noise, every creak of the cabin. I didn't know if the man had followed me or if he was still out there, but I wasn't taking any chances. I waited until morning, when the sunlight finally broke through the trees. When I felt it was safe, I packed up my things and left. The drive back was long, my mind still racing. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I didn't think they would believe me. The cabin was beautiful, yes, but that night, that tapping would stay with me. I never went back. And to this day, I still don't know who that man was or why he was out there, tapping on the trees. But I know one thing. I'm never staying in a cabin like that again. The wind howled through the dense trees, bending the pines as I pulled up to the cabin. It was late, and the sky had long since turned dark, casting shadows across the gravel driveway. The headlights of my old truck illuminated the cabin's wooden frame, but I could barely make out the details. Just the rough, faded boards and the chimney puffing out thin curls of smoke. It looked like something out of an old postcard, the kind of place where you'd expect to find a storybook villain lurking in the corner. But I wasn't thinking about that. I was just looking for a break from the grind of my life, somewhere I could unwind and forget about everything back home. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just a weekend of peace, away from work, the noise of the city, and the constant hum of social media. Just me and the woods. I had rented this cabin online, simple, rustic, with no frills. The kind of place you go to recharge and disconnect. I'd gotten a good deal on it, too, which should have been a warning in hindsight, but I was too tired to care. I'd been driving for hours, and all I wanted was to get inside, put my feet up, and sleep. I parked the truck and grabbed my bags. The air was crisp, with a faint smell of pine and something earthy. The cabin was situated in a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods. The kind of place where you couldn't see your neighbors, if there were any. Felt isolated, but in a good way, like I was far from everything but safe. The key was under the mat, just like the listing had said. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, letting out a sigh of relief as I took in the familiar scent of wood and dust. The place was small, just a single room with a loft above, but it had everything I needed. A small kitchen, a wood stove in the corner, and a few mismatched pieces of furniture that gave it a lived-in feel. The bed in the corner was large and inviting, with a thick quilt thrown across the top. I dropped my bags by the door and started a fire in the stove, the crackle of the burning wood filling the silence of the cabin. The flickering light cast shadows across the walls, but it felt cozy, like I was settling in for a long night of peace. I took my jacket off and tossed it on the chair by the door. There was no phone signal out here, so I figured I'd just make the most of it. No calls, no texts, no emails. Just me and the fire. I found a book I had been meaning to read, cracked it open, and lost myself in the pages. Time passed slowly, the light from the fire growing dimmer as the hours ticked by. Felt good being out here alone. Around midnight, I put the book down and stretched, deciding to go outside for a bit of fresh air. The night was still and quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the whisper of the wind through the trees. The cabin was nestled into a small hill, so I stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out over the forest. The stars were clear above, scattered across the black sky like glitter, and the moon hung low, casting an eerie glow on the landscape. It felt like a different world out here, so far from anything I knew. As I stood there, just taking it all in, something caught my attention. A sound, a low thud, followed by a scraping noise. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't an animal. There was no rustling of leaves or the sound of a bird. It was like something or someone was moving through the woods. My heart rate quickened, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a fallen branch or a large animal brushing against a tree. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer. I stood still, trying to listen more carefully, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I took a deep breath, shaking off the unease that had crept up on me, and made my way back inside. Maybe I was just tired. It had been a long day. The fire was still burning, but the heat had started to fade. I added a few more logs to the stove and sat down again, trying to lose myself in the book. But the sound kept echoing in my head. The thud, the scrape, like something was outside, just out of sight. I glanced at the clock. It was well past 1 in the morning. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was just imagining things. The wind was probably playing tricks on me. The trees were old and creaky after all. I didn't want to check outside again. I told myself to just relax, to enjoy the solitude. But then there was a knock. At first, I thought I was hearing things. I had to have been. But it came again. 3 sharp raps at the door, followed by a long pause. I stood frozen, my mind racing. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, knocking on my door at this hour? There was no way I was going to open it. I had rented the cabin by myself, and the last thing I wanted was some stranger showing up in the dead of night. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy iron skillet, and held it in my hands, just in case. I didn't know what to do. My mind was running in circles, trying to think of all the possible scenarios. Maybe it was just someone lost, someone who needed help. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. But then the door handle began to turn. Couldn't breathe. Every muscle in my body tensed. My grip on the skillet tightened as the door handle rattled, then stopped. A pause, and then the knock came again, louder this time, as if whoever was outside was impatient, frustrated. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? But I didn't even have a phone signal. There was no one for miles. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. I backed away from the door slowly, my mind screaming for me to do something, anything. But there was nothing. I was alone, in a cabin in the middle of the woods, with some stranger outside. The handle turned again. This time, I couldn't stop myself. I had to know who it was. I pressed my back against the wall beside the door, the skillet in my hand trembling slightly. Slowly, I pulled the door open a crack, just enough to see who or what was on the other side. But there was nothing. No person, no figure standing in the shadows, no one at all. Just the empty porch and the darkened woods beyond. I stared at the empty space for a long time, trying to make sense of it. There was no way someone had just vanished. The sound of the knock, the rattling handle, it had all been so real. After a few minutes, I closed the door and locked it again, but the unease lingered. My hands were still shaking as I sat back down by the fire, trying to ignore the fact that my heart was still racing. Sleep was nearly impossible after that. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of the wind, every crackle of the fire had me on edge. But eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early, the light of dawn creeping in through the small window. I felt like I hadn't slept at all, my body stiff and sore from tossing and turning. I didn't want to stay inside. I needed to get out to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and went outside, breathing in the cool morning air. The woods were still quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But the memory of last night hung in my mind like a shadow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to take a walk, hoping that the exercise would help calm my nerves. The forest around me was thick and dense, the trees towering high above, their branches stretching out like arms. The ground was soft underfoot, covered in a carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles. As I walked, I found myself looking over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit, half expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the trees. But there was nothing, just the forest, silent and still. After about an hour, I found a small stream that cut through the woods. I knelt beside it, dipping my hands into the cool water, trying to clear my mind. The peaceful sound of the water rushing over the rocks was soothing, and for a moment, I felt like I was starting to shake off the fear from the night before. But then I saw something in the water, a flash of light. I stood up quickly, heart pounding in my chest. There, at the edge of the stream, half hidden by the rocks, was a small, weathered box. It was a strange thing to find out here, in the middle of nowhere. I crouched down and picked it up, my fingers brushing against the damp wood. The box was old, and the surface was covered in moss, but it was intact. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside was a stack of photographs, old ones, faded and worn at the edges. I flipped through them one by one, my stomach sinking as I realized they were all pictures of this cabin, taken years ago, long before I'd ever rented it. And in every single one, there was a person standing just outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. I turned the pictures over, hoping for some kind of clue, anything that might explain what I was seeing. But there was nothing, just the same person, their face obscured by shadows in every shot. I felt sick. This was no coincidence. Someone had been watching this cabin long before I showed up. Someone had been here. I stood up, the box still in my hands, as the weight of the situation crashed down on me. I didn't know what to do,